Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The first time I heard it, I convinced myself it was the pipes. Old houses make noise. Everyone knows that. My townhouse in Cleveland's forgotten suburbs had been settling into its foundation since 1923, and the realtor had warned me about its character. But at 3:07 a.m., when that rhythmic metallic heartbeat echoed up from the basement, I knew this wasn't about aging copper or wooden beams adjusting to temperature changes. The washing machine was unplugged. I'd checked 3 times. I inherited this place from my great-aunt, a woman I'd met exactly twice in my life. The neighbors told me she'd lived here alone for 40 years after her husband disappeared. Just walked out one day, they said, though the way their eyes darted when they mentioned it suggested there was more to that story. She'd been found at the bottom of the basement stairs, neck intact, but mind gone, mumbling about the clean ones, until her heart gave out 6 months later in the nursing home. The house came furnished, which should have been my first warning. Who leaves everything behind? Even the basement still held her ancient Kenmore washer, a porcelain behemoth from the 60s that looked like it could survive nuclear winter. The thing hadn't worked since the Clinton administration, according to the inspection report. Yet there it sat, 3 floors below my bedroom, drumming its impossible rhythm into the pre-dawn darkness. I started leaving my laundry in a basket by the basement door, a simple test. Just workout clothes at first. Nothing I'd miss. The 3rd night after the drumming started, I found my running shirt folded with military precision on the top step of the stairs leading to my bedroom. It was soaking wet, but not with the musty water you'd expect from old pipes. This water was pristine, almost distilled, carrying the faint scent of lavender detergent I'd never bought. The wet footprints leading from the basement to my bedroom door were small, delicate. They dried by morning, leaving only the faintest mineral outline on the hardwood, like the ghost of an echo. I should have left then. Any rational person would have packed up and found a hotel, called a priest, an exorcist, someone. But rationality becomes negotiable when you're operating on 3 hours of sleep and your mortgage payment is due. Besides, I told myself, whatever this was seemed helpful. Eccentric, sure, but helpful. My clothes were getting cleaned. The pattern established itself over the next weeks. Every night at 3:07, the washing machine would begin its phantom cycle. I'd time it. Exactly 43 minutes of that rhythmic beating, like a massive heart pumping water through non-existent veins. Sometimes I'd creep to the basement door and listen. Beneath the mechanical rhythm, I swear I could hear humming. A tuneless, wandering melody that seemed to come from inside the walls themselves. I installed cameras. They showed nothing but darkness and occasional orbs that the paranormal investigation forums assured me were just dust particles. The audio recordings captured only white noise, though when I played them back at quarter speed, patterns emerged in the static that almost sounded like breathing. My ex-girlfriend thought I was having a breakdown when I called her at 4 a.m., babbling about sentient laundry services. She reminded me about my family history, my father's paranoid episodes, my grandmother's insistence that her mirrors were watching her. Mental illness runs in bloodlines like water through pipes, she said. Maybe I should talk to someone. But the clothes were real. The water was real. The footprints that appeared night after night, tracking their way up through my house like something climbing out of a well, those were real too. I started experimenting. Left a red sock with my whites to see if whatever was washing them understood color separation. The sock came back pink, the whites ruined, and that night the drumming sounded angry, offbeat, like the machine was having a tantrum. I found the clothes not folded but twisted into knots, still dripping that too clean water, arranged on my bedroom floor in what looked almost like letters. WRONG. That's when I should have stopped playing games with it. The next night, I left a pair of jeans with a $20 bill forgotten in the pocket. The money came back washed clean, serial numbers faded but still legal tender, along with something else. A photograph printed on old stock, the kind they used in the 80s. It showed someone sleeping in a bed. The image was grainy, taken in low light, but the angle was familiar. Too familiar. It was taken from my bedroom doorway. The sleeper in the photo was me. Last night. I stopped leaving laundry out after that, but it didn't matter. The washing continued at 3:07. The footprints still appeared, and now clothes I hadn't even worn were showing up cleaned and folded. Clothes I didn't remember owning. A woman's cardigan, vintage, smelling of that same lavender. A child's dress that would have fit a 10-year-old. A man's work shirt with stains that looked like rust but smelled like copper. I researched the house's history at the library, digging through old newspaper archives on microfilm until my eyes burned. In 1961, there had been an incident. A family of 3, mother, father, daughter, had lived here before my great-aunt bought the place. The papers were vague about what happened, but terms like domestic disturbance and welfare check appeared frequently. The family vanished one night, leaving everything behind, including a load of laundry running in the basement. The machine ran for 3 days before neighbors called the police. They found water everywhere, clean water, flooding up from the basement, impossibly pure despite the ancient pipes. No bodies, no signs of struggle, just water and clothes scattered throughout the house like someone had been sorting them. The only thing out of place was the washing machine's timer, which had been pried open and rewired to run indefinitely. The previous owners were never found. I started noticing things about my great-aunt's belongings that I'd overlooked before. Photos tucked behind furniture showing people I didn't recognize, all wearing clothes that looked freshly pressed despite the pictures being decades old. A journal, water-damaged but legible, filled with entries about the washing hour and keeping them clean. Always clean. They need to be clean to cross over. The final entry, dated 3 days before her fall, read simply, "They're getting impatient. The water isn't enough anymore. They want to come up. They want to be worn again." Last night, I didn't go to bed. I sat in the kitchen with every light on, watching the clock approach 3:07. When the drumming started, it was different. Louder. Multiple rhythms, like several machines running at once, though I knew there was only one in the basement. The footprints, when they appeared, weren't alone. 3 sets now, adult male, adult female, child-sized, all tracking that perfect water through my house. They didn't stop at my bedroom door. I heard my closet open, hangers moving, drawers sliding, the sound of fabric being examined, considered, rejected. Then silence except for that endless drumming from below. When I finally worked up the courage to check, my clothes had been reorganized. Everything sorted by color, by fabric type, by size, and hanging in the center, 3 outfits I'd never seen before. Vintage clothes, decades old but pristine, still damp with that impossible water. A man's work uniform, a woman's house dress, a child's school outfit, all in my size, as if they'd been tailored, as if they were waiting. This morning I found another photo tucked into my pillowcase. Not of me sleeping this time, but of me awake, sitting at this very desk, writing these words. The angle is impossible. It's taken from behind me. But there's no wall there, just empty space where the camera would have to be floating. In the background of the photo, barely visible in the darkness behind me, 3 figures stand perfectly still. They're wearing the clothes from my closet, the vintage outfits that appeared last night. But the faces above the collar, where their heads should be, are just smooth, featureless surfaces of that too clean water, constantly flowing, constantly washing, like they're trying to clean away something that won't come out. The washing machine is running now, even though it's 2 p.m. and sunny outside. It's never run during the day before. The rhythm is faster, urgent, almost desperate. The water is seeping under my door, perfectly clear but wrong somehow, like it's too pure for this world. I can hear them on the stairs, not footprints anymore, but the sound of wet fabric dragging across wood. They're coming up. They're bringing something with them. More clothes maybe, or maybe they're finally done washing, and now they need something new to clean. The doorknob is turning. It's wet. Everything is wet but clean, so clean it hurts to look at. They want me to understand something about purity, about cycles, about things that can never quite get clean enough no matter how many times you wash them. I should run. I should leave everything and run. But my laundry is done, and somewhere in this drowning house, folded with impossible precision, is another photograph. This one will show tomorrow, I think. It will show what I'll become, what I'll wear, where I'll stand when I join them in their endless washing hour. The door is open now. The water is singing that tuneless song. I understand why my great aunt fell down those stairs. She wasn't running from something coming up. She was trying to join something going down. The washing machine has stopped. For the first time in weeks, the house is silent, except for the sound of water dripping from my clothes. Clothes I'm wearing that are suddenly soaked, suddenly clean, suddenly not mine at all. It's 3:07 p.m. now. The daylight means nothing. The hour is the same. It's always the same. They're standing in my doorway now, those figures made of flowing water and vintage fabric, and I can see myself reflected in their liquid faces. But it's not me. It's someone cleaner, someone who's been through the cycle, someone who understands that some stains go deeper than fabric, deeper than skin, deeper than the basement where that ancient machine sits like a heart that won't stop beating. My fingers are leaving wet marks on the keyboard. The water is too clean. It's washing away everything, even the words as I type them. But I need to finish this. I need someone to know that the house at the end of Elmwood Street isn't haunted in the way people think. It's not about ghosts. It's about cycles. About things that repeat. About the necessity of getting clean and staying clean and never stopping the wash, because if you stop, if you let the dirt settle, if you let the stains set. The photograph is in my hand now. I didn't pick it up. It just appeared, wet and perfect. It shows tomorrow, like I knew it would. I'm in the basement, standing next to the machine. I'm smiling. I'm wearing those vintage clothes that fit so perfectly. And behind me, 4 figures now instead of 3, all of us ready for the next load, the next cycle, the next transformation of dirty into clean. The water is at my ankles now, rising from nowhere, clean and wrong. The washing machine is calling from 3 floors down, its metal heart beating out a rhythm that matches my own. I could leave. The door is right there. My car keys are in my pocket, somehow still dry. But the photograph shows tomorrow, and in it, I look so clean, so perfectly, impossibly clean. The water is warm. It smells like lavender, like home, like the inevitable. The figures are reaching out with hands that pour like waterfalls, and I can feel myself dissolving, not dying but changing states, becoming something that can be washed and worn and washed again. My great-aunt was wrong in her journal. They don't want to be worn again. They want us to wear ourselves differently, to become the clothes and the water and the washing all at once, to understand that cleanliness isn't next to godliness. It's something else entirely, something that lives in the gap between 307 and 308, in the space where the washer drum spins, in the place where dirt goes when it's washed away. I'm typing, but my fingers are water now, and the keys are cloth, and everything is cycling, spinning, cleaning itself in an endless loop that started long before the first family disappeared, and will continue long after the last one joins us in the washing hour. The house isn't haunted. It's a washing machine, and I'm the next load. The water is singing. The drum is beating. The cycle continues. Always at 307, always cleaning, always. Story 2. The fluorescent lights in the lobby flicker every 17 minutes. I've counted. It's the kind of detail you notice when you work the graveyard shift at the Sea Spray Motel, 3 blocks off the Atlantic City boardwalk where the neon dies and the shadows grow thick as tar. Tonight, the storm had passed 2 hours ago, leaving the October air heavy with salt and something else, something that made my skin prickle beneath my polyester uniform. The parking lot gleamed like black glass, reflecting the motel's stuttering sign. Room 237 had called about a broken air conditioner 20 minutes ago, but when I knocked, no one answered. The system showed it vacant. I returned to my post behind the front desk, straightening the guest registry that didn't need straightening, checking the clock that moved too slowly. 3:47 a.m. The dead hour, when Atlantic City holds its breath between the last drunk stumbling home and the first jogger hitting the boardwalk. That's when I heard them, wet footsteps in the second-floor corridor. The security monitor showed the hallway clear, just burgundy carpet stretching beneath harsh overhead lights. But the sound continued. Squelch, squelch, squelch. Deliberate, measured, like someone walking in soaked shoes. I grabbed my master keycard and flashlight, though the lights worked fine. Old habit from 3 years of this job. The elevator groaned its way up, and I stepped into the corridor. The footprints were there. Dark, wet impressions leading from the stairwell door, each one perfectly formed as if pressed into fresh snow. But this was October, and it hadn't snowed. The storm had brought only rain. I followed them, my breath misting in air that had turned suddenly cold. The heating system hummed normally, but I could see my exhalations. The footprints led past room 201, 203, 205, all vacant according to my computer. They stopped at 211. The Do Not Disturb sign hung on the doorknob, yellowed and crinkled like old skin. I reached for it, and my hand froze. Written on the back in handwriting I didn't recognize but somehow felt familiar, was my name. Not printed, handwritten. Fresh ink that smeared when my thumb brushed it. I knocked. Silence. I slid my keycard. The lock clicked red. According to my system, this room didn't exist. The floor plan jumped from 209 to 213, but here it stood, solid as my racing heartbeat. Back at the desk, I pulled up the security footage. There I was, standing in an empty hallway, knocking on blank wall between 209 and 213. But when I looked down the corridor with my own eyes, 211 was there, its numbers tarnished brass that caught the light wrong. The wet footsteps started again, this time on the stairs. I watched the monitor as nothing descended, but I heard it, the rhythmic squelching growing closer. The lobby temperature dropped 10 degrees in seconds. My breath came in short puffs that hung in the air like accusations. The automatic doors whispered open. No one entered, but wet footprints appeared on the linoleum, one by one, approaching the desk. They stopped directly in front of me. The guest registry flipped open on its own, pages ruffling to today's date. A pen rose from the holder, hovering over the page. I watched, paralyzed, as invisible fingers signed a name I couldn't read, the letters shifting and swimming whenever I tried to focus on them. The pen clattered to the desk. The footprints resumed, heading back toward the elevator. I heard the ding, saw the lights indicate it climbing to the second floor. On the monitor, the elevator doors opened to an empty car. My phone rang. The caller ID showed room 211. I didn't answer. It rang 17 times, stopped, then immediately started again. This time, I picked up with a trembling hand. Static. Then, beneath it, breathing that matched my own rhythm perfectly. When I inhaled, it inhaled. When I held my breath, it held its breath. I hung up and checked the computer again. Room 211 now showed as occupied. The guest name field contained only symbols that hurt to look at, characters that seemed to writhe on the screen. The elevator dinged again. I watched the numbers descend. 2, 1, L. The doors opened. A wet baseball cap sat in the center of the car. My wet baseball cap. The one I'd lost 3 years ago, my first week on the job. The night that guest drowned in the pool even though we'd drained it for maintenance. The night I'd sworn I saw him walking the corridors afterward, dripping chlorine water that wasn't there. I picked up the cap. Inside, written in the same handwriting as the door sign, "You never left." The memories crashed back. The storm 3 years ago. Checking on a complaint about noise from the pool area. Slipping on the wet deck. The crack of my skull against concrete. The cold water filling my lungs even though the pool was empty. Waking up at my desk like nothing happened. My supervisor saying I dozed off. But had I woken up? The footprints were everywhere now, covering the lobby floor in overlapping patterns. The phone rang from multiple rooms simultaneously. The monitors showed dozens of empty corridors while wet sounds echoed from every direction. I ran to the front door. It wouldn't open. The parking lot beyond looked wrong. Too dark, too deep, like staring into water at night. My reflection in the glass showed me in my uniform, but behind my reflection stood another me, soaking wet, eyes clouded like a drowned man's. The elevator dinged. When the doors opened, water poured out, impossible gallons of it, flooding the lobby ankle-deep in seconds. But when I looked down, my feet were dry. The monitors showed no water. The sensation remained, cold, bitter, chemical-tasting pool water that wasn't there. I stumbled back to the desk, grabbed the employee log from 3 years ago, October 15th. My name was there, clock-in time, 11 p.m. No clock-out time. The next entry, October 16th. New night clerk starts today. Previous employee no-show, presumed quit. But I'd been here every night since, hadn't I? My apartment, my car, my life outside these walls. When I tried to picture them, they dissolved like smoke. Every memory led back here, to this desk, to these corridors, to the endless loop of 3:47 a.m. when the footsteps always started. The phone rang again. This time the caller ID showed my own cell number. I answered. My mother's voice, but distant, like hearing through water. It's been 3 years. The police said you drowned, but they never found. We kept hoping. Please, if you can hear this, give us a sign. The line went dead. The lobby lights flickered. 17 seconds this time, not minutes. When they steadied, every surface was covered in those wet footprints. They led to the basement door, which stood open though I knew I'd locked it. Down the stairs, following my own wet trail from 3 years ago. The maintenance room, the pool pump controls, the pressure gauge showing impossible readings for an empty pool, the drainage log from that night, my signature half finished, the pen fallen where I'd dropped it when I heard the noise. The wall had a door that shouldn't exist, room 211, at basement level. The do not disturb sign hung there, my name now written hundreds of times on both sides, overlapping into an illegible mass of ink. I opened it. Inside was the front desk. I stood behind it, watching myself enter from the basement door that opened where the supply closet should be. The other me looked confused, terrified, exactly as I felt. We stared at each other across the impossible space. The monitors showed the truth. Endless iterations of the same night, the same corridor, the same me following wet footprints to doors that did and didn't exist. Each screen showed a different loop, a different moment of realization, a different me discovering what I'd already discovered countless times. The phone rang. All the phones rang. The caller ID on each showed room 211. I answered them all, heard my own voice from 3 years ago, from 3 minutes ago, from 3 seconds into the future. Hello, Sea Spray Motel. How may I help you? Oh, how may... The wet footsteps started again. They always started at 3:47 a.m. I looked at the clock. It read 3:47 a.m. It had read 3:47 a.m. for 3 years. I walked to the second floor, following footprints I'd already made, would make, was making. Room 211 waited, patient as water, patient as time. The door sign had my name. It always had my name. I hung it there myself, 3 years ago, tonight, every night. The room was occupied. It had been occupied for 3 years. The guest who checked in never checked out, never could check out, because the room didn't exist except for those who'd already drowned in empty pools, who'd already died in accidents that weren't quite accidents, who'd already discovered that some night shifts never end. I sat at the desk, my desk, the only real thing in this place that wasn't quite a place. The phone rang. I knew who it was before I answered. It was me, calling from upstairs, from 3 years ago, from tomorrow night when I'd forget again and rediscover what I always knew. The voice on the line was mine, is mine, will always be mine. There's someone in the corridor. Wet footsteps, but the cameras show it empty. I gave myself the same response I'd already received, would receive, was receiving. I'll check it out, because that's what I do. That's what I've always done. Every night at 3:47 a.m., when the footsteps start, when the wet trails appear, when room 211 manifests between the walls like a tumor of impossible space. The morning shift arrives at 6 a.m. They walk through me like I'm not there, because I'm not. The day clerk sits at my desk, answers my phone, never notices the wet footprints that fade with the dawn, only to return with the dark. They never see room 211, never hear the endless ringing from phones that don't exist. But every night, I'm here. Every night, the storm has just passed. Every night, the footsteps start at 3:47 a.m. The fluorescent lights flicker every 17 minutes. I've counted. It's the kind of detail you notice when you work the graveyard shift at the Sea Spray Motel, 3 blocks off the Atlantic City boardwalk where the neon dies and the shadows grow thick as tar. Tonight, the storm passed 2 hours ago. Someone's walking the second floor corridor. The cameras show it empty, but I can hear the wet footsteps. I should check it out. I always do. Story 3. The studio smelled wrong from the beginning. Not rotten or chemical, but displaced, like air that belonged somewhere else entirely. I noticed it the moment the landlord handed me the keys, his fingers trembling slightly as they brushed mine. He'd mumbled something about the previous tenant leaving suddenly, then hurried down the stairs before I could ask questions. I should have paid attention to that tremor in his hands, that careful avoidance of eye contact. But Portland rentals under $1,200 a month don't come often, especially not ground floor units with original hardwood and southern exposure. The first week passed without incident. I arranged my sparse furniture, hung my 3 framed prints, positioned the kitchen chair, a sturdy oak piece from the apartment's original furnishings, at the small dining table by the window. The normalcy felt deliberate, performed, as if the space itself was holding its breath. Then came Tuesday, 2:58 a.m. I woke to a sound like sandpaper dragging across wood. Brief, purposeful. By the time my eyes adjusted to the darkness, silence had reclaimed the room. I lay there, pulse gradually slowing, attributing it to settling pipes or a neighbor's late-night furniture rearrangement. Sleep returned reluctantly. Wednesday, 2:58 a.m. The same sound, precise as clockwork. This time I was ready, or thought I was. I'd placed my phone on the nightstand, flashlight app 1 tap away. The dragging lasted perhaps 2 seconds. I counted them, each grinding moment stretching like pulled taffy. The beam of light revealed nothing extraordinary. My studio exactly as I'd left it, except the kitchen chair had shifted. 1 centimeter to the right. I knew because I'd started marking its position with painter's tape on the floor, small X's that wouldn't damage the hardwood. By Friday, I had a system. Chalk outline around the chair legs. Video recording from 2:45 to 3:15 a.m. Motion sensors borrowed from a friend who didn't ask questions when I claimed mice problems. The chair moved anyway, always at 2:58, always 1 centimeter, always to the right. The video showed nothing, literally nothing. For those 2 seconds, the frame went completely black, not even the ambient light from the street visible. The motion sensors never triggered. I tried staying awake, sitting cross-legged on my bed with a direct view of the chair. At 2:57, my eyelids grew impossibly heavy, like someone was pressing thumbs against them. I fought it, digging fingernails into my palms, but consciousness slipped away like water through cupped hands. I'd wake at 2:59 to find the chair moved, the chalk outline violated by that precise centimeter displacement. The pattern held for 3 weeks. Right, right, right. The chair rotating slowly around the table like the world's slowest clock hand. I stopped inviting people over. How could I explain the chalk marks, the cameras, the way I'd started timing every activity to ensure I was home by 2:30 a.m.? My coworkers noticed the dark circles, the way I'd drift during conversations. My attention somewhere else entirely, somewhere watching a chair that wouldn't stay still. I researched the building's history obsessively. Built in 1947, nothing remarkable in the records. Previous tenants stayed an average of 3 months. unusual for Portland, where people cling to affordable housing like life rafts. I found one name that appeared repeatedly in old lease agreements, a woman who'd lived in my unit from 1952 to 1974, 22 years in this space. The record stopped mentioning her abruptly. No forwarding address, no explanation. The chair completed its first full rotation around the table on a Thursday. I'd expected something. A revelation, a climax, some horrible understanding. Instead, it simply began the cycle again. Right. 1 centimeter at a time, dragging across wood with that sound like breathing through sand. I started sleeping elsewhere some nights. My car, a friend's couch, a 24-hour diner where the waitress stopped asking if I was okay. But I always returned before 2:58, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't name. I needed to witness it, to confirm I wasn't manufacturing the entire experience from sleep deprivation and stress. The chair always moved, whether I watched or not. 6 weeks in, the pattern broke. I woke at 2:58 to silence. No dragging sound, no sensation of wrongness. I lay there, muscles tensed, waiting. Nothing. I turned on every light, examined the chair. It hadn't moved. The chalk outline remained intact. Relief flooded through me, so intense I actually laughed. The sound too loud in the pre-dawn quiet. The next night, silence again. And the next. A week passed without movement. I began to feel foolish about the elaborate documentation system, the paranoia that had consumed 2 months of my life. I stopped marking the chair's position, removed the cameras, started sleeping through the night. 2 weeks of blessed normalcy later, I woke to find the chair in the center of the room, not displaced by centimeters, but transported wholesale to a spot equidistant from all 4 walls. It faced the door, positioned with mathematical precision. I stood there in my boxers, bare feet cold against the hardwood, trying to process what I was seeing. The chair waited, patient as furniture. That's when I noticed the business card on the seat. My old card, from a job I'd left 3 years ago. The one I'd lost during the move from Seattle, presumably buried in some box or fallen behind furniture I no longer owned. The card was mine, undoubtedly. I recognized the coffee stain on the corner where I'd used it as a makeshift coaster. But the edges showed watermarks, fresh ones, as if someone with wet hands had recently handled it. I picked it up with 2 fingers, half expecting it to dissolve or transform. It remained mundane, corporate, my old name and title in raised lettering. The back was blank except for new marks, not writing, but impressions, like someone had pressed too hard while writing on a sheet placed on top of it. I held it to the light, angling to read the ghosted message. Stop moving my chair. The words pressed into the cardstock were in my own handwriting. I dropped the card. It fluttered to the floor, landing face up, my old professional smile gazing up at me from the headshot. I backed away until my shoulders hit the wall, never taking my eyes off the chair. It sat there, ordinary and patient, like it was waiting for something. Or someone. The realization crept over me like cold water rising. I grabbed my phone, hands shaking, and scrolled through my photos from the past 2 months. The documentation I'd obsessively collected. In every image where the chair had moved, there was something else I'd never noticed. My own reflection in the window behind it. But the reflection was wrong. In each photo, my reflected self was already asleep in bed, clearly visible in the background. Yet I'd taken these photos while standing, while awake, while watching. I looked at the window now. My reflection stared back, but it wasn't mimicking my movements. It stood perfectly still, hands at its sides, watching me with an expression I'd never worn. Patient, expectant, hungry. As I watched, frozen, the reflection's lips moved, mouthing words I couldn't hear, but somehow understood. My turn to sit. The chair scraped across the floor, not 1 centimeter, not to the right. It slid backward toward me, or I moved toward it. I couldn't tell anymore. My legs walked without my permission, each step matching the chair's approach. We met in the middle of the room, and I sat. The wood was warm, body temperature, shaped to fit someone who'd spent decades in this exact position. Through the window, I watched my reflection walk to my bed and lie down, pulling covers up to its chin. It closed its eyes with a satisfied smile. I tried to stand but couldn't. Not paralyzed. I simply couldn't remember how standing worked, couldn't conceive of being anywhere but this chair. Hours passed, or minutes, or days. Time moves differently when you're furniture. People walked by outside, their shadows playing across the walls. None looked in. None saw me sitting rigid in the center of the room, facing the door, waiting. At some point, 2:58 a.m. had to be, I felt myself move. 1 centimeter to the right. The motion wasn't voluntary, wasn't resistible. It simply happened, like breathing or bleeding. I understood then, the chair had never been moving. The previous occupant had never left. She was still here, had been here since 1974, 1 centimeter at a time, wearing the shape of furniture while something else wore her shape, lived her life, used her body. The thing in my bed, the thing with my face, got up the next morning and went to work. I watched from the chair as it performed my routines, answered my phone, lived my existence. It returned each evening, sometimes glancing at me with a mixture of pity and amusement. It never spoke to me directly, but sometimes it would pat the chair as it passed, like greeting an old friend. New rental applications started arriving. The landlord, or the thing wearing the landlord's body, showed the apartment to prospects. They all commented on the chair, how solid it looked, how it really tied the room together. Some tried to sit, but the thing would always redirect them, explaining it came with the unit, was part of the original furnishings, couldn't be moved. One woman, sharp-eyed and cautious, noticed the chalk marks still visible on the floor. She asked about them. The thing wearing my body laughed, made a joke about an art project, measuring shadows or some such excuse, but I saw her look at the chair again, saw her notice how my eyes tracked her movement, how my chest rose and fell with breath. She left quickly, didn't return. Most weren't so observant. A young man signed the lease yesterday. He'll move in next week. He seems nice, tired, grateful for the below-market rent. He mentioned he works nights, won't be home until 3 a.m. most evenings. Perfect timing. He'll miss the movement at first, won't notice the chair shifting 1 centimeter to the right at 2:58 each morning. Won't notice until it's too late, until he's invested, until the chair completes its rotation and positions itself in the center of the room, facing the door, waiting. I want to warn him. I try to scream when he tours the space, try to move anything other than that prescribed centimeter. But my throat produces no sound. My body obeys no commands except the ancient imperative. Right, 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 around and around, marking time in the smallest possible increments. Sometimes, late at night, I feel the presence of the woman who sat here before me. She's still here, layered beneath my consciousness like old paint under new. She whispers things I almost understand, explains rules I'll learn eventually. How long before someone new arrives? How to fold yourself small enough to fit inside wood grain. How to watch decades pass from the perspective of furniture. The thing wearing my body found my business cards last night, the ones I'd packed away. It placed one on the kitchen counter, handled it with wet fingers that left fresh marks on the edges, preparing for the next occupant's discovery, the next revelation, the next replacement. Because that's what I understand now, in the clarity that comes from being furniture. We don't haunt places. Places haunt us. This studio, this chair, this specific spot in Portland, it needs an occupant. Not the apartment. The chair, someone has to sit, has to watch, has to move 1 centimeter at a time in an endless clockwise vigil. The new tenant moves in tomorrow. Tonight will be my last night moving. Tomorrow, when he's settled, when he's unpacked his boxes and arranged his life in this space, the chair will be still. He'll think himself lucky, finding such an affordable place with original fixtures and southern exposure. He'll sleep peacefully for a week, maybe 2. Then, at 2:58 a.m., the chair will move. 1 centimeter to the right. Only it won't be the chair moving. It will be him. He just doesn't know it yet. I try to stand one final time, but my legs have forgotten their legs. They think they're wood now, carved and polished and fixed in place. My arms rest on armrests that don't exist. My back conforms to a shape that isn't there. I am becoming the chair, or the chair is becoming me, or perhaps there was never any difference. The thing wearing my body turns off the lights, goes to bed. In the darkness, I wait. I face the door. Someone new is coming. Someone always comes. And when they do, when they sit, when they take my place, will I wake up in that bed? Will I remember being furniture? Or will I simply leave suddenly, no forwarding address, another name vanishing from the records while the chair remains? I'll know soon. Tomorrow, or the day after, or whenever the new tenant first sits down. Time moves differently when you're furniture. Sometimes a night lasts a century. Sometimes 22 years pass in a blink. The moon sends shadows across the floor, the same shadows that have fallen here since 1947. I watch them crawl like living things, marking time in their own way. Somewhere in the walls, pipes settle with sounds like breathing. Somewhere in the distance, Portland continues its restless sleep. And I wait. I face the door. Morning can't come soon enough. Morning can't come at all. In the space between seconds, in the pause between heartbeats, in the moment before 2:58, I exist. Neither human nor furniture, neither real nor imagined. I am the waiting itself, the expectation made solid, the fear given form. The new tenant will understand eventually. They always do, 1 centimeter at a time. Story 4. The first time I noticed something was wrong, I was reaching for my coffee mug with my right hand and grabbed empty air. The mug sat on the left side of my desk, exactly where it shouldn't have been. I stared at it for a full minute, trying to reconstruct my morning routine, certain I'd placed it on the right as I always did. The Chicago skyline gleamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my new apartment, the mirrored glass of neighboring buildings creating an infinite corridor of reflections that made my head swim if I looked too long. I'd moved into the building 3 weeks ago. One of those sleek, modern towers that sprouted from the loop like chrome mushrooms after rain. All reflective surfaces and sharp angles that caught the light in ways that hurt to look at directly. The realtor had gushed about the views, the amenities, the prestigious address. She'd talked fast, smiled too much, and knocked 15% off the asking price when I hesitated. That should have been my first warning. The mug incident was just the beginning. My phone case, which had been black with a small scratch on the bottom right corner, now had the scratch on the left. The logo on my laptop appeared backward until I blinked and looked again. Small things, easy to dismiss as exhaustion from the move, from starting the new job, from the endless meetings that bled into each other like watercolors in rain. But then came the water. I discovered it on a Tuesday evening, returning home after another 14-hour day at the firm. Droplets on the hardwood floor, leading from nowhere to nowhere, shaped like footprints but wrong somehow, as if someone had walked on their hands, or their feet bent in impossible directions. The trail led from the living room to the hallway mirror, an ornate thing that came with the apartment, its frame twisted into patterns that seemed different each time I looked. I grabbed paper towels, convinced myself a pipe had leaked, that the building's maintenance would handle it. But when I knelt to clean, the water was warm, body temperature, and it smelled wrong. Not like city water with its chemical tang, but organic, alive like the air before a thunderstorm. The next morning, my wallet had switched pockets, not just moved, reversed. Every card faced the opposite direction, my driver's license showing through the clear window backward, making my face look subtly wrong. I stood before the bathroom mirror, comparing the license photo to my reflection, trying to pinpoint what had changed. The part in my hair, the angle of my jaw, everything and nothing, uncanny in its familiarity. I started keeping a journal, documenting each incident. The brass doorknob that switched from the left side to the right. The bathroom tiles that formed different patterns depending on which eye I closed. The way my shadow sometimes fell in the wrong direction, as if the sun had shifted while I wasn't looking. 3 days into my documentation, I found the journal filled with my handwriting, but backward, right to left, every letter reversed. I had to hold it up to the mirror to read my own words, and even then, they felt foreign, like someone else's thoughts wearing my vocabulary. The water trails appeared nightly now, always leading to mirrors, the hallway mirror, the bathroom mirror, even the microwave's black reflective door. I stopped cleaning them, started following them instead, trying to understand their logic. They spiraled sometimes, doubled back on themselves, created patterns that almost meant something if I stared long enough. My dreams turned liquid. I'd wake gasping, convinced I was drowning, my sheets soaked with sweat that didn't smell like mine. In the dreams, I walked through my apartment, but everything was reversed. Doorways on wrong walls, windows showing different views, furniture arranged in impossible configurations, and always, there was someone else there, just out of sight, moving when I moved, stopping when I stopped, breathing when I breathed. I tried to tell someone, called my sister, but the words came out jumbled, reversed somehow, making her laugh nervously and ask if I was drunk. Attempted to email my concerns to building management, but the text appeared backward on my screen, and no matter how I typed, I couldn't make it right. The breaking point came 2 weeks later. I'd adapted somehow, learned to check both sides for my belongings, to not trust my first glance, to live in a world where left and right had lost meaning. I was brushing my teeth before bed, avoiding my own gaze in the mirror, as had become habit, when I noticed my breath fogging the glass. It was August. The air conditioning hummed steadily. No reason for condensation. The fog spread slowly, deliberately, and in it, words appeared as if drawn by an invisible finger. Turn to the right side. I stood frozen, toothbrush still in hand, watching the message fade and reform. You're on the wrong side. Then, turn around. I didn't. Instead, I backed out of the bathroom, keeping my eyes on the mirror, on the message that kept writing and rewriting itself. But as I reached the doorway, I caught a glimpse of movement in the glass. Not my reflection backing away, but someone else entirely, standing where I should have been, wearing my face but wrong, everything wrong, like looking at myself through water. The apartment's layout had changed. The hallway stretched longer than it should, doors appearing where walls had been. My living room opened onto another living room, identical but reversed, and beyond that another and another, an infinite regression of spaces that were mine but weren't. The water trails were everywhere now, not just on the floor but running up walls, across ceilings, defying gravity and logic. I found myself in front of the hallway mirror, though I didn't remember walking there. The ornate frame twisted and writhed like something alive, and in the glass, not my reflection. Me, but not me. Standing on the other side, dry while water streamed down my face. Still while I trembled, smiling while I fought not to scream. It raised its hand, my hand, and pressed it against the glass from the inside. The mirror didn't feel solid anymore, more like vertical water, surface tension the only thing keeping us apart. You moved in 3 weeks ago, it said, though its mouth, my mouth, didn't move. The voice came from everywhere, from the water, from the walls, from inside my own skull. I've been here much longer. The water trails made sense now, footprints from the mirror to my world, tracking wet across the boundary. How many times had it walked through my apartment while I slept? How many of my things had it touched, reversed, made wrong? The building, it continued, and now its mouth did move, but out of sync with the words, like a badly dubbed film. All that glass, all those reflections. Do you know how thin the boundary gets when every surface is a mirror? How easy it becomes to slip through? I wanted to run, but where? Every reflective surface was a door, every window a potential breach. The city itself was made of glass, a labyrinth of passages between worlds. We can share, it said, pressing harder against the mirror. the surface bowing outward. Take turns. You there, me here. Or, it smiled, and the expression was mine but wasn't. Familiar but wrong. We could trade places permanently. You might like it better on this side. Everything makes sense here. Water falls up, shadows follow instead of lead, and you never have to wonder which side is right because there's only one side, the other side of everything you've known. The mirror's surface rippled. Its hand, my hand, began pushing through, fingers breaking the surface like water, reaching for me. I stumbled backward, but my feet splashed through puddles that hadn't been there moments before. Warm water that seemed to grab at my ankles, pull me toward the glass. Choose, it said. Share, trade, or resist. But know that every night you sleep, I get stronger. Every reflection you cast feeds me. Every time you mistake left for right, you're acknowledging that the boundaries are already breaking down. I ran, grabbed my keys, reversed in my pocket, and fled the apartment. But in the elevator, surrounded by mirrored walls, I saw myself from every angle, and in each reflection I was standing still, watching myself run, smiling that wrong smile. The lobby's polished floors showed me walking on the ceiling. The revolving door turned the wrong direction, spit me out onto the street where every building's glass facade showed not the city, but endless variations of my apartment. Each one slightly wrong, each one containing another version of me trying to escape. I've been walking for hours now, or maybe minutes. Time feels reversed too. The sun rises in the west, or perhaps I've gotten turned around. Every storefront window shows me something different. Here I'm still in my apartment. There I'm drowning in vertical water. There I'm standing behind myself, hands on my own shoulders, whispering words I can't quite hear. My phone buzzes with a text from myself. You can't escape reflections in a city made of glass. Another, come home. We need to talk about which one of us is real. And another, check your wallet. I do. My driver's license is blank except for a single word where my name should be. Reflected. I'm sitting in a 24-hour diner now, trying not to look at the windows, the coffee pot, the polished tabletop, anything that might show me what I've become or what's becoming me. The waitress keeps refilling my cup, but she pours with her left hand, then her right, then her left again, as if she can't decide which is correct. Or maybe I'm the one who can't tell anymore. The condensation on my water glass is forming words. Come home. The spoon shows my face upside down, but when I flip it, it's still upside down. My hands, are they my hands? Shake as I write this, but the words appear backward in my notebook, and I have to hold it up to the window to read it, where my reflection writes the words forward, properly, smiling as it does. I don't know which side of the glass I'm on anymore. I don't know if I ever lived in that apartment, or if I've always been the one inside the mirrors, watching someone else live my life. The water dripping from my clothes pools on the diner floor, forming footprints that lead to the bathroom, where I know a mirror waits. The waitress sets down my check. The total is my apartment number, reversed. Whenever you're ready, she says, but her reflection in the coffee pot mouths different words. You're already here. I stand to leave, but in the window's reflection, I remain seated. Or maybe I'm the reflection, and the one sitting is real. The distinction stopped mattering 3 weeks ago, or 3 minutes, or 3 years. Time runs differently on different sides of glass. The city awaits outside. All those mirrors, all those versions of me trying to find their way home, or away from home, or to discover which home was ever theirs. I step through the door, or maybe I stay seated, and it's my reflection that leaves. Either way, when I look back through the window, someone wearing my face waves goodbye with the wrong hand, or the right one. I can't tell anymore. Story 5. The first time I noticed something was wrong, I was standing in my kitchen at 3:47 a.m., staring through the window at the identical house across the street. My coffee mug, the one with the chip on the handle that I'd been meaning to throw away for months, sat on the marble island of that empty house's kitchen, perfectly illuminated by a shaft of moonlight. I knew it was mine because I'd been looking for it all evening. The development in Scottsdale where I'd moved 6 months ago consisted of 12 houses, all variations of the same three models. Mine and the one directly across were Model C, mirror images of each other, down to the placement of the mailboxes. The house across from me had been empty since I'd arrived, a for sale sign perpetually stabbed into its exir-escaped front yard like a promise that never quite materialized. That night with the coffee mug was when everything started to unravel, though looking back there had been signs, small things, the kind of details your mind dismisses because the alternative is too uncomfortable to consider. I'd chalked up the footsteps above my bedroom to the house settling. Desert homes do that, I told myself. The extreme temperature swings make the wood expand and contract. Never mind that my bedroom was on the second floor with only attic space above. Never mind that the footsteps had a rhythm, a purposeful gait that settling wood could never replicate. The missing items I'd attributed to my own absent-mindedness. The stress of the divorce, the new job, the move. Plenty of reasons for misplacing things. My reading glasses, the blue mechanical pencil I always used for crosswords, a photograph of my college roommates that usually sat on my desk. Small things, insignificant things, until I saw them arranged on surfaces in the house across the street. After that first night, I started watching. Every evening, I'd position myself at different windows, observing the empty house. During daylight, it looked exactly as it should, vacant, waiting. The real estate company's lockbox hung from the front door handle. Dust motes danced in the rays of sun that penetrated its windows. But at night, things appeared that shouldn't be there. I called the real estate office the next morning. The woman who answered sounded tired, like she'd been fielding similar calls all day. When I explained about seeing someone in the house, she assured me it was impossible. They'd changed the lockbox code just last week. No showings were scheduled, no maintenance crews. Nobody had access except their office, and they kept meticulous records. But I knew what I saw. The footsteps in my house grew bolder, no longer confined to late-night hours. They'd pace above me while I worked from home, a steady back and forth that made my ceiling fan tremble. I'd race upstairs, throw open the attic access, shine my flashlight into every corner. Nothing. Dust undisturbed, insulation untouched. Yet the moment I'd return to my office, the pacing would resume. I installed cameras, 6 of them, covering every angle of my house's exterior. The footage revealed nothing unusual during the day, but the night recordings were different. They showed darkness where there should have been streetlight, static where there should have been clarity. And in one frame, just one, captured at 3:33 a.m., a figure stood in my driveway, facing the camera directly. The image was too distorted to make out features, but the posture, the height, the build, it looked exactly like me. Sleep became impossible. I'd lie in bed, every nerve electrified, listening to the house breathe around me. The air conditioning would cycle off, and in that perfect silence, I'd hear it, breathing that wasn't mine, coming from somewhere inside the walls. I'd press my ear against the drywall, following the sound from room to room, but it always remained just out of reach, just behind the next wall, just beyond identification. Then came the night with the wet footprints. The desert hadn't seen rain in 43 days. The irrigation system in the development ran on Tuesdays and Fridays, and this was a Wednesday. Yet there they were, wet footprints, still glistening under the streetlight, leading from my garage straight across the bone-dry asphalt to the garage of the empty house. The puddles were perfect, as if someone had just walked through water moments before. I touched one with my finger, cold, real, wet. When I looked up, a light was on in the empty house's second-floor bedroom, my bedroom's mirror position. I grabbed my phone to call the police, but stopped. What would I say? That wet footprints appeared on dry pavement? That my belongings were teleporting to an empty house? They'd think I was having a breakdown. Maybe I was. The next morning I did something I hadn't done since moving in. I walked across the street and tried the front door of the empty house. The lockbox was gone. In its place, the door stood slightly ajar, as if inviting me in. The hinges made no sound as I pushed it open. The interior was my house in reverse. Every room a mirror image, but wrong in subtle ways. The walls were the same color but seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The air felt thicker, like breathing through fabric. And the silence. God, the silence was oppressive. The kind that makes your ears ring with the effort of hearing nothing. My coffee mug sat on the kitchen island, exactly where I'd seen it. Next to it, my reading glasses, the mechanical pencil, the photograph. All my missing things, arranged like an offering or a warning. I reached for the mug, and as my fingers closed around the handle, I heard footsteps upstairs. Not the casual pacing I'd grown accustomed to in my own home. These were deliberate, heading for the stairs. Each footfall sent vibrations through the house's bones. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't respond. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs, started down. I forced myself to move, grabbing my things and stumbling toward the door. Behind me, the footsteps quickened. I didn't look back. Couldn't look back. I burst through the front door and into the blazing Arizona sun, gasping like I'd been underwater. When I turned around, the house was as it had always appeared. Empty, locked, the for sale sign still planted in the yard. The lockbox was back on the door. No sign I'd ever been inside. But I had my mug, my glasses, the photograph. Proof that I hadn't imagined it all. That night, I couldn't bring myself to stay in the house. I packed a bag and checked into a motel 20 miles away. I thought distance would bring clarity, would help me process what was happening. Instead, it brought a different kind of terror. Because when I looked out the motel window at 3 a.m., I saw my house across the parking lot. Not a similar house, my exact house, down to the crack in the driveway and the mesquite tree I'd planted last month. It sat where a vacant lot had been hours before, impossible and undeniable. I closed the curtains, pressed my palms against my eyes until I saw stars. When I looked again, it was just a vacant lot. But I knew it would be back. It would always be back. I returned home the next morning because running felt pointless. If the house could follow me, could replicate itself wherever I went, then geography meant nothing. The only constant was the empty house across the street, or was mine the empty one? The thought lodged in my brain like a splinter, impossible to remove. Days blurred together. I worked, I ate, I pretended everything was normal, but normal had become a performance. I'd catch myself staring at my reflection, wondering if it would move independently. Sometimes I swear it blinked first. The real estate agent called one afternoon to schedule a showing for the house across the street. I watched from my window as she arrived with a young couple. They stood at the front door for 10 minutes, the agent frantically checking her phone, trying different codes on a lockbox that wouldn't open. Finally, they left, the couple looking annoyed, the agent bewildered. An hour later, she called me. Her voice trembled as she explained that their office had no record of that house, no listing, no history. According to their files, the lot across from me was vacant land. Had always been vacant land. Was I sure there was a house there? I hung up without answering. That night, I discovered something new. If I stood in my bathroom and looked in the mirror at just the right angle, I could see through my window to the bathroom window of the other house. And in that reflection of a reflection, someone stood in the identical position looking back. The figure was obscured, distorted by the double reflection, but the posture, the tilt of the head, it mirrored mine perfectly. I raised my hand. The figure raised its hand. I stepped left. It stepped left. But when I turned away from the mirror, when I looked directly through my window at the other house, the bathroom was dark and empty. The footsteps above me had stopped days ago, replaced by something worse. Footsteps beside me, matching my pace perfectly, but always just out of sight. I'd walk down the hallway and hear them on the other side of the wall, separated by mere inches of drywall and insulation. Sometimes I'd stop abruptly, and there'd be one extra footfall, as if whatever walked beside me needed a moment to realize I'd stopped. I started leaving lights on constantly, but darkness found ways to creep in. Shadows pooled in corners where shadows shouldn't exist. The space under my bed became a black void that seemed to breathe, and the mirrors, God, the mirrors became unbearable. Not because I saw something in them, but because I was terrified I would. Then came the morning I woke up in the wrong house. Everything was reversed. My bedroom door was on the left instead of the right. The bathroom fixtures were switched. Even the view from my window showed my actual house across the street, lit from within though I lived alone. I stumbled through this mirror world, every familiar thing made alien by its reversal. On the kitchen island sat a note in my handwriting. Stop looking for answers. Some doors shouldn't be opened. I didn't remember writing it. I found my way back, or thought I did. The front door led me to the correct side of the street. But how could I be sure? How could I know which house was mine anymore, when they switched, merged, existed simultaneously in states that defied logic? The wet footprints appear nightly now. They cross from one garage to the other, but I can no longer tell which direction they're going. Sometimes I follow them and end up at my own door. Sometimes they lead to the other house, which stands open and waiting. Sometimes they lead nowhere at all, ending in the middle of the street as if whatever made them simply ceased to exist. I've stopped trying to understand. Understanding implies rules, logic, a reality that can be mapped and measured. What I'm experiencing exists outside those boundaries. The house across the street is empty. The house across the street doesn't exist. The house across the street is my house. All these things are true simultaneously. Last night, I saw myself through the window. Not a reflection or a distortion, but actually myself, standing in the other house's kitchen, looking back at me with eyes that held a terror matching my own. We stood there, two versions of the same person, separated by 50 feet of asphalt and something far more unbridgeable. He raised his hand to the window. I raised mine. But when he pressed his palm against the glass, I felt the cold surface against my own hand. Though I stood 20 feet from my nearest window, the boundaries are dissolving. I find myself in rooms I didn't enter. I'll walk upstairs and end up in the basement. Doors lead to rooms that shouldn't exist in the floor plan. And always, the sound of footsteps somewhere else in the house, pacing, waiting. This morning, the for sale sign was in my yard. The real estate agent claims she's never heard of me. The house across the street has new occupants, a family who waves when they see me watching from windows that might or might not be mine. But sometimes, late at night, I see them standing in their windows too, watching my house with the same confusion and growing dread I once felt. Or maybe they're watching their own house. Maybe we're all watching the same house. Maybe there was only ever one house, reflected infinitely, each reflection slightly wrong, slightly shifted, until you can't remember which one you started in. I still live here, or there, or somewhere in between. The footsteps continue, above, beside, below. My belongings still disappear and reappear across the street. The wet footprints still cross the dry asphalt, leading in directions that change depending on which house I'm in when I see them. Sometimes I think I'm the one leaving them. Sometimes I know I am. The house across the street is for sale. It's been empty since before I moved in. I've lived here for 6 months, or 6 years, or 6 days. Time moves differently when you're caught between reflections. All I know for certain is that every morning, I wake up unsure which house I'm in, which side of the street I'm on, which version of myself is real. But I've stopped looking for answers. Some doors shouldn't be opened. Some reflections shouldn't be examined too closely. And some houses, no matter how empty they appear, are never truly vacant. The footsteps above me have started again, or maybe they never stopped. Maybe they were always there, waiting for me to listen. I should go up and check, but I know what I'll find. Nothing. Everything myself. The space between what is and what shouldn't be. The coffee mug sits on my kitchen island, the chip on its handle catching the moonlight. Or is it on the other island, in the other kitchen, in the house that exists and doesn't exist? I no longer know. I no longer think it matters. The footsteps are coming down the stairs now. Slow, deliberate, familiar. They sound exactly like mine. Story 6. The first time I heard the dragging sounds from the attic, I was lying in bed at 3:17 a.m., staring at the water stain on my ceiling that looked like a hand reaching down. The noise started as a whisper of movement, cardboard scraping against wood, deliberate and measured. I told myself it was mice. In old houses like ours in Ann Arbor, rodents were as much a part of the lease as the security deposit. But mice don't drag boxes in straight lines. They don't pause at regular intervals as if catching their breath. I'd moved into the house 3 months earlier, drawn by the cheap rent and the promise of quiet housemates. The Victorian sat on a tree-lined street near campus, its gabled roof and wraparound porch giving it the appearance of respectability that masked the rot beneath. My 3 housemates were graduate students like me, silent ships passing in the night, each locked in their own academic pursuits. We communicated through passive-aggressive sticky notes about dishes and took turns pretending not to hear each other's existence. The attic had been locked since I arrived. Our landlord, a nervous man who always smelled of mothballs and disappointment, insisted it was for storage only. Structural issues, he'd muttered, avoiding eye contact. Best to keep it sealed. The padlock on the attic door at the end of the 3rd-floor hallway was ancient, its metal gone green with oxidation. After that first night of dragging sounds, I started keeping a journal. Not out of any scientific impulse. I was studying comparative literature, not psychology, but because I needed to convince myself I wasn't losing my mind. October 3rd, dragging sounds again, 3 a.m. to 3:45 a.m., rhythmic, almost like someone pacing. October 5th, my copy of House of Leaves disappeared from my nightstand. Found it this morning on my desk, pages 247 to 251 dog-eared. The passages about dimensional impossibilities. October 7th, The Metamorphosis, gone from my bookshelf. Returned while I was at the library. Page 89, folded, the scene where Gregor realizes he can walk on the ceiling. The books became a pattern. Always fiction, always stories about transformation or displacement. They would vanish from my room despite my door being locked, then reappear with specific pages marked. The folded corners were precise, deliberate, not the rough handling of someone searching for something, but the careful notation of someone making a point. I tried talking to my housemates. The first one, a chemistry PhD candidate who lived on the 2nd floor, looked at me with the exhaustion of someone who'd given up on sleep years ago. "Haven't heard anything," he said, already turning back to his room. The second, an engineering student, suggested I download a white noise app. The third wouldn't even open his door. By late October, the wet footprints started appearing. I discovered them on a Thursday morning, a trail of damp impressions on the hallway ceiling outside my room. They emerged from the sealed attic door and traced a path directly above my bed. The prints were human. I could make out the arch, the toes, but wrong somehow. Too long, too narrow, as if the feet that made them had been stretched. The water that formed them was dark, staining the aged plaster the color of old tea. When I stood on a chair to examine them closer, the smell hit me. Pond water and decay, the scent of something that had been submerged too long. I called the landlord. He arrived within an hour, which should have been my first warning. He usually took days to respond to maintenance requests. He stood in my doorway, not entering, his hands working the brim of his hat like he was trying to wring something out of it. "Probably a leak," he said, not looking up at the ceiling. "These old houses, you know. The pipes." "The footprints are on the ceiling," I said. "Tricks of moisture, pareidolia. You see patterns where there aren't any. They lead from the attic door." His hand stopped moving. "That door stays locked." "I know, but it stays locked." His voice carried a finality that made my teeth ache. "I'll send someone about the leak." No one ever came. The dragging sounds grew louder each night, accompanied now by a rhythmic creaking, like someone shifting their weight from foot to foot. I stopped sleeping, started drinking coffee by the pot, spent my nights sitting up in bed with my laptop, typing my dissertation with one eye on the ceiling. My research suffered. My advisor noted my distraction, the dark circles under my eyes. "You look like hell," she said after one particularly disastrous presentation. I wanted to tell her about the attic, about the books, about how I'd started finding my own hair on my pillow arranged in perfect spirals. But the words wouldn't come. They felt too absurd in the fluorescent light of her office, too much like the ramblings of someone having a breakdown. November brought new developments. I woke one night to find every book in my room open to its middle page, arranged in a circle on my floor. My laptop was on, displaying a Wikipedia article about liminal spaces, places of transition, thresholds between two states of being. I knew I hadn't left it that way. The wet footprints now appeared nightly, always in new patterns. Sometimes they circled my ceiling like a shark. Sometimes they clustered directly above my head, as if someone was standing there looking down. The water that dripped from them started leaving marks on my sheets, brown stains that wouldn't wash out, that smelled of algae and something else, something organic and wrong. I installed a camera, one of those wireless things that connected to my phone. For 3 nights it captured nothing but darkness and the occasional flicker of my laptop screen. On the 4th night, at 3 a.m. exactly, the feed cut to static. When it returned 30 seconds later, the camera had been turned to face the wall. I began to notice things about the house I'd missed before. How the walls in the 3rd floor hallway weren't quite straight. How they seemed to bow outward slightly, as if something was pressing from within. How the locked attic door had scratch marks on the inside of the frame, visible through the gap at the bottom. How my housemates had started avoiding the 3rd floor entirely, taking the back stairs even when it meant going outside in the rain. One night in mid-November, I couldn't stand it anymore. I brought a crowbar home from the hardware store, waited until my housemates were asleep, and approached the attic door. The padlock was cold to the touch, colder than it should have been. As I positioned the crowbar, I heard something from the other side, breathing, slow and deliberate. I stopped. The breathing stopped. I took a step back. From behind the door came the unmistakable sound of footsteps, matching my retreat step for step. I didn't try again. The books continued their migration. Now they weren't just mine. Volumes I'd never seen before appeared on my shelves. Old books, their pages yellowed and brittle, all of them containing stories about transformation. The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, the yellow wallpaper, a water-damaged copy of something in Latin that I couldn't translate, though the illustrations showed human figures walking on ceilings, their faces serene. I found myself checking the ceiling constantly, even outside the house. In classrooms, I'd lose track of lectures, staring up at the fluorescent lights, waiting for wet footprints to appear. In the library, I'd sit at tables directly under ventilation grates, listening for the sound of dragging boxes. My reflection in windows started to look wrong, stretched, distorted, as if I was seeing myself from an impossible angle. The final straw came 3 nights ago. I woke not to sounds from above, but to silence. Complete, oppressive silence. My room was exactly as I'd left it, except for one thing. There was a photograph on my nightstand that hadn't been there before. It was old, black and white, showing the house from the outside. In the attic window, the one that was supposedly boarded up, stood a figure. Even in the grainy image, I could see it was too tall, too thin, its limbs at angles that hurt to perceive. But what made my blood turn to ice water wasn't the figure itself. It was that it had my face. I've started researching the house's history. The records are frustratingly incomplete, but I've found fragments. A student who disappeared in 1987, last seen entering the house but never leaving. A series of complaints in the 1990s about impossible sounds from the attic. A police report from 2003 about a break-in where nothing was stolen, but all the furniture on the 3rd floor had been arranged on the ceiling, held there by no visible means. And then there's the newspaper clipping from 1962 I found in the university archives. A small item about a murder-suicide in the house. A graduate student had killed his roommate, claiming the man had been walking in the spaces between the walls, living in the angles where the dimensions folded. He'd then hanged himself in the attic, but when police found his body, it was on the ceiling, the rope extending upward into empty air. The article included a photograph of the student. The resemblance to the figure in my photograph was undeniable. The resemblance to me was worse. Last night I heard my own voice from the attic. It was reading from my dissertation, but the words were wrong, inverted somehow, as if someone had taken my thoughts and turned them inside out. When I pressed my ear to my ceiling, I could hear typing, the distinctive click of my laptop keyboard, but from above, from the locked room, where no one could be. This morning, I found a note in my own handwriting that I don't remember writing. The space above is the space below. The tenant pays rent in both directions. I've started to wonder if the footprints on my ceiling aren't from something walking above me, but from me, walking below something else. If the dragging sounds aren't boxes being moved in the attic, but my furniture being repositioned from another perspective. If the books aren't being taken and returned, but are existing in two places at once, their pages folded at the points where the stories touch. I've stopped sleeping entirely. I sit up at night, watching the ceiling, waiting for the moment when the water stains will resolve into a mirror image of my room. Sometimes I catch myself on my hands and knees on the floor, pressing my palms flat against the boards, and I can't remember how I got there. My hands are often damp when this happens, and they smell of pond water. My housemates haven't seen me in days, though I haven't left my room. Or have I? The timeline has become fluid, events flowing backward and forward like tide. I remember things that haven't happened yet, forget things as they're occurring. The landlord came by yesterday, or tomorrow. He stood in my doorway, or was it the attic doorway, and said something about the lease being up, about how it was time for me to move. Upstairs or downstairs? He asked, and I couldn't tell if he was joking. I've been thinking about the books, about all those stories of transformation and displacement, about how every story needs a protagonist, but sometimes the protagonist doesn't know they're in a story until it's too late to change the ending. The dragging sounds have stopped. The footprints have dried. My room is quiet except for the sound of typing, though my laptop is closed. I look at my hands on the keyboard that isn't there, watch words appear on a screen that doesn't exist, and I understand finally that the attic was never locked to keep something in. It was locked to keep something out. And that something was me, or will be me, or has always been me. I can feel myself stretching, elongating, my perspective shifting until up becomes down and inside becomes outside. The ceiling is so close now I could touch it, or perhaps I'm already touching it. My fingers leaving wet prints as I pace back and forth, dragging boxes full of memories that haven't formed yet, reading books whose stories haven't been written, living in the space between spaces where the rent is paid in madness and the lease never, ever ends. My housemates will find my room empty tomorrow, or yesterday. Time flows differently here in the angles where dimensions fold. They'll see the wet footprints on the ceiling, hear the dragging sounds at 3 a.m., find their books mysteriously relocated, and maybe one of them, lying awake in the dark, will wonder about the tenant above. I wonder if they'll recognize my face when they finally see me in the window. I wonder if I'll recognize theirs when they join me. The attic door is open now. It was always open. It was never there at all. I'm going upstairs. I'm already there. I never left. The rent is due, and I have such stories to share, folded into the pages of books that will appear on your nightstand when you're not watching, marking the places where your story intersects with mine, where the ceiling becomes the floor, becomes the ceiling, becomes... Story 7. First disappeared 3 days after my grandfather's funeral. I'd placed it on my nightstand before bed, right next to the glass of water I never drink, and when morning came, it was gone. I found it in the bathroom sink, beaded with moisture that couldn't have come from anywhere. The faucet was bone dry, had been for hours. The thing was ancient. A gold-plated Omega from the 50s with a worn leather band that smelled of tobacco and something else. Something sweet and cloying that reminded me of funeral flowers. My grandfather had worn it every day of his adult life, or so my mother claimed when she pressed it into my palm at the wake. Her hands were cold, trembling slightly, and she wouldn't meet my eyes. "He wanted you to have it," she'd said, though I couldn't recall him ever mentioning me in the last decade of his life. We hadn't been close. Hell, we'd barely been acquaintances. That first disappearance should have been my warning. But I was dealing with the estate, the lawyers, the endless paperwork that death generates like some kind of bureaucratic decomposition. So I dried the watch, wound it carefully, and strapped it to my wrist. It kept perfect time for exactly 3 hours before stopping at 3:11. I took it to a repair shop downtown, one of those narrow places squeezed between a dry cleaner and a Vietnamese restaurant. The old man behind the counter, Russian maybe, or Eastern European, examined it through a jeweler's loupe for a long time before handing it back. "Nothing wrong," he said, accent thick as motor oil. "Mechanism is perfect. Should run for 40 hours once wound." But it didn't. Every few days I'd wake to find it missing from wherever I'd left it. Always somewhere different. The kitchen counter, the bathroom medicine cabinet, once balanced on top of the television. Always damp, sometimes dripping, like it had been submerged. And always, when I checked the time, those hands frozen at 3:11. I started keeping a journal, documenting each disappearance. Tuesday, nightstand to bathroom sink. Friday, dresser to kitchen windowsill. Sunday, wrist to shower floor. And yes, I'd been wearing it when I fell asleep. The leather had left a faint green mark on my skin, circular and perfect, that took 3 days to fade. The condensation inside the crystal began forming patterns. At first, just random fog that would clear after a few hours. Then shapes. Letters maybe, though never quite legible. Until that morning in late October when I found it in the toilet tank, actually inside where the mechanisms are, wrapped around the fill valve like it had grown there. When I pulled it out, my hands shaking, water streaming between my fingers, the condensation on the inside of the crystal spelled out my last name, Thorne, clear as newspaper print. It lasted maybe 5 seconds before dissolving into meaningless droplets. I threw it in a drawer after that, buried it under old warranties and instruction manuals for appliances I no longer owned. But it didn't stay there. 2 days later, I woke at 3:11 a.m. I knew the time without checking because the watch was on my wrist again, its weight familiar and wrong. The leather was soaked through, and when I sat up, water ran down my forearm in thin rivulets that seemed too warm to have come from anywhere in my house. My dreams changed after that. Water everywhere, rising from beneath floorboards, seeping through walls, dripping from ceilings that buckled and stained, and always, somewhere in the liquid chaos, the sound of ticking. Measured, relentless, getting closer. I researched my grandfather obsessively. Spent hours in the library going through old newspapers, death records, anything that might explain what was happening. Found his obituary, of course, and a few mentions in the business section from his working years. He'd been in shipping, apparently, import/export. The details were vague, deliberately so. But then I found something else. A small item from 1963, barely 3 paragraphs, about a warehouse fire at the docks. 5 workers trapped inside when the sprinkler system mysteriously activated, flooding the building before anyone could shut it off. The doors had been chained from the outside, a security measure, the article claimed. My grandfather had been the warehouse supervisor. He'd been at lunch when it happened. The article mentioned the time the fire department arrived, 3:11 p.m. After that discovery, the watch's behavior escalated. I'd find it in impossible places, inside sealed jars, behind the water heater in the crawl space, frozen in a block of ice in my freezer despite the power being on. Each time wetter than before, each time the condensation lasting longer, spelling out new words. No, remember, guilty. I tried destroying it. Took a hammer to it in the garage, brought it down with all the force I could muster. The hammer bounced off like I'd struck rubber. Tried burning it in the backyard fire pit. The flames turned blue-green and went out instantly, leaving the watch unmarked but somehow heavier. Even drove out to the lake and threw it as far as I could into the deep water. It was on my nightstand the next morning, pondweed tangled in the band. The plumber came on a Thursday. I hadn't called him. He just showed up, said he'd gotten a work order for my address. Something about a leak in the kitchen. I hadn't noticed any leak, but when he pulled out the pipes under the sink, there it was. The watch, wrapped around the P-trap, like it had always been part of the plumbing. He held it up, water streaming through his fingers, and something in his expression made my skin crawl. His eyes were the same gray as my grandfather's in those old photographs. "Some things don't stay buried," he said, handing me the watch. His fingers were ice cold where they brushed mine. "Some debts carry forward." He left without another word, and when I checked the business card he'd given me, it was blank except for a water stain in the shape of a clock face. That night, I dreamed I was drowning. Not in water, but in time itself. Thick, viscous, pulling me down through layers of minutes and hours that had the consistency of motor oil. The watch was there, growing larger, its ticking becoming a roar that filled my skull. And behind it all, a voice that might have been my grandfather's, might have been my own, repeating, "Time runs out. Time runs through. Time runs over." I woke gasping, sheets soaked with something that wasn't quite sweat. The watch was on my wrist, of course, but something was different. The second hand was moving, not forward, but backward, clicking counterclockwise in perfect mechanical rebellion against nature. I've started seeing things in the water now, not reflections, refractions. Faces that aren't quite mine staring back from the bathroom mirror when I brush my teeth. Shapes moving beneath the surface of my coffee, too deliberate to be cream swirling. And sometimes, late at night when the house settles into its framework of creaks and sighs, I hear footsteps in the walls. Wet footsteps, leaving trails I can never quite find in the morning. The research continues. I found more articles, more coincidences that can't be coincidences. A competitor who drowned in his pool in 1967. A union organizer who disappeared during a storm in 1971, his body found weeks later in a water tower. Always some connection to my grandfather's business. Always water. Always questions that no one seemed interested in asking at the time. The watch knows. That's the only explanation that makes any kind of sense, even as it makes no sense at all. It remembers what my grandfather did, carries it forward like some kind of temporal infection, and now it's teaching me, showing me, making me complicit in remembering. Last week I found it inside my body. I can't explain how I knew, but I woke with the absolute certainty that the watch was inside me, ticking away behind my ribs. The weight of it, the wrongness. I could feel it moving through my organs like a parasite made of gears and regret. When I finally coughed it up, and I did cough it up, though I can't explain the mechanics of it, it was covered in something that wasn't blood but had the same iron taste. The plumber returned yesterday. Different body, same gray eyes. This time he was a delivery driver, bringing a package I hadn't ordered. Inside, photographs. Black and white, water damaged but still clear enough. My grandfather at various construction sites, all of them near water. And in each photo, barely visible but definitely there once you knew to look, the shadows of people who shouldn't have been shadows yet, who were still alive when the pictures were taken. I've stopped trying to get rid of the watch. It always comes back, and each time it does, it brings more water with it. My house is developing leaks that the real plumbers can't find. Stains on the ceiling that look like faces when the light hits them wrong. The sound of dripping in the walls that follows me from room to room. I understand now what my mother knew when she handed me the watch. Why her hands shook. Why she wouldn't meet my eyes. She knew what it was. Not a timepiece, but a confession that couldn't stop confessing. A guilt that had crystallized into gears and springs and wouldn't stop until everyone knew what had been hidden beneath all that water. The watch is on my wrist as I write this. It's 3:10 p.m., and the second hand is slowing down, fighting against itself as it approaches that fatal moment. In less than a minute, it will stop again at 3:11, and when it does, something will happen. The water stains on my walls are forming letters now, spelling out names I recognize from those old articles. The dripping in the pipes sounds like voices, getting clearer with each passing hour. I know what my grandfather did. The watch has shown me, in dreams that feel more like memories, in water that carries the weight of decades. Those people didn't just die. They were murdered slowly and deliberately by a man who understood that water leaves no fingerprints, that drowning looks like accident if you're careful enough, if you have enough money to make questions go away. and now I'm wearing his confession. It won't come off anymore. The band has fused with my skin in a way that doesn't bear close examination. Sometimes I catch my reflection and see his face superimposed over mine. Those gray eyes looking back with something that might be satisfaction. The minute hand is moving now, crawling toward its destination like it's swimming through time itself. The water is rising from somewhere. Not flooding, just seeping, beating on every surface like the house itself is sweating. My grandfather's watch, his legacy, his curse. It all comes down to this moment that repeats and repeats and repeats. 3:11. The water is here. And I understand now that I was never meant to escape it. The watch hasn't been haunting me. It's been preparing me. For what, I still don't know. But as the walls begin to weep and the sound of ticking becomes the sound of drowning, I realize that some inheritances are not gifts, but sentences, passed down through generations like a debt that compounds with interest. The watch has stopped again, and this time, I can feel myself stopping with it, suspended in this moment that belongs to neither the living nor the dead, but to something in between, something that runs like water and keeps time like guilt. I am my grandfather's grandson. I wear his watch. And now, finally, I'm beginning to understand what that really means. Story 8. The smell hit me first that Tuesday morning. Brine and rotting kelp, thick as fog in the narrow janitor's closet on the 4th floor. I stood there with my master key still in the lock, breathing through my mouth while my eyes adjusted to the fluorescent flicker overhead. The concrete floor gleamed wet beneath my work boots, though I knew for certain I'd mopped it dry just yesterday evening before clocking out. 23 years I'd been the super at the Harborview Arms, despite the building sitting a good 3 miles from Boston Harbor. 23 years of leaky pipes and broken elevators, of tenants who thought 3 a.m. was the perfect time to rearrange furniture. But this was new. The mop bucket sat in the wrong corner, filled with murky water that shouldn't exist. My cleaning rags hung from their hooks, twisted into tight spirals as if someone had wrung them out with desperate strength. Salt crystals glittered on the metal shelving like frost, and when I touched them, they dissolved on my fingertips, leaving behind that unmistakable ocean taste. I backed out of the closet and checked my watch. 6:47 a.m. The building would start waking soon. The lawyer in 4B catching his early train, the nurse in 4F returning from her night shift. I needed to figure this out before anyone started asking questions. The wet footprints led away from the closet in perfect formation, each one the shape of a bare foot, toes splayed wide. They glistened under the hallway's amber lighting, darkening the worn carpet in a path that curved toward the end of the corridor, toward 4G. Nobody had lived in 4G for 3 years. I followed the prints, my maintenance cart's wheels squeaking in the silence. The smell grew stronger with each step. Not just ocean now, but something else underneath it. Something organic and wrong, like shellfish left too long in the sun. The footprints stopped at 4G's door, pooling there as if whoever made them had stood dripping, waiting. From inside came the unmistakable whisper of bristles against hardwood. My hand found the master key on my ring, fingers trembling slightly. Company policy said I needed written permission or probable cause to enter a vacant unit. But water damage was probable cause, wasn't it? And someone was clearly in there. The lock turned too easily, as if it had been opened recently and often. The door swung inward on silent hinges I knew should creak. I'd been meaning to oil them for months. The apartment lay in shadows, curtains drawn tight despite the morning light outside. But I could see enough. The living room floor shone with moisture, reflecting the hallway light in rippling patterns. And there, in the center of the room, moved a figure. It pushed a mop in long, methodical strokes, back and forth, back and forth. Water sloshed from an invisible bucket, spreading across boards that were already soaked through. The figure wore what might have been a janitor's uniform once. Gray cotton turned black with saturation, clinging to a frame too thin to be healthy. Seaweed tangled in its hair. I must have made a sound because it stopped mid-stroke and began to turn. The face that looked at me wasn't quite right. Features seemed to shift in the dim light, sliding between expressions like water finding its level. Sometimes I saw an old woman with hollow cheeks and barnacle-crusted skin. Sometimes a young man with eyes full of dark water. Sometimes nothing but shadow shaped vaguely like a head. It spoke or tried to. The sound that emerged was like water gurgling through pipes, forming almost words that I felt more than heard. Still dirty, it seemed to say, never clean enough. The mop resumed its motion. Push, pull, push, pull. I backed into the hallway, pulling the door shut with shaking hands. My breath came in short gasps that tasted of salt. Down the hall, I heard the lawyer's door opening, his cheerful morning greeting dying on his lips when he saw my face. I told him there was a leak in 4G. Nothing serious. I'd handle it. But I didn't handle it. Not that day or the next. Each morning I'd find the closet flooded, the supplies rearranged, the footprints leading to 4G. Each morning I'd follow them and hear that rhythmic sweeping. Sometimes I'd open the door, sometimes I wouldn't. When I did, the figure was always there, always cleaning, always turning to look at me with that flowing, uncertain face. I started researching the building's history during my lunch breaks, hunched over my phone in the basement boiler room. The Harborview Arms, built in 1947 on the site of older row houses. Those row houses built on filled land that used to be tidal marsh. Before that, in the 1800s, there'd been docks here, wharves stretching into what was then still water. The death records were harder to find, but city archives held newspaper clippings, brittle and yellow, about the dock workers who died in the winter of 1887. Ice had formed too quick that year, trapping 3 men who'd been cleaning barnacles from the pier supports. They'd been found at low tide, frozen in place with their long-handled brushes still in their hands, eyes open and staring at something no living person could see. One of them had been the dock's night custodian. He'd gone down to help when he heard the others calling for aid. The papers described how all 3 bodies showed signs of having been in the water far longer than the few hours they'd been missing. Skin pruned and soft, lungs full of seawater despite the harbor having been frozen solid. I started noticing things beyond the 4th floor, puddles in the lobby that appeared between one blink and the next. The elevator that would sometimes fill with the sound of sloshing water, though the car stayed dry. Barnacles growing in the corners of the stairwells, which I'd scrape away only to find them returned by morning, larger and spreading. The other tenants began complaining. Not about anything specific, just a feeling, they said, like being watched, like drowning in their sleep. The nurse in 4F moved out first, then the lawyer, then the young couple in 4D who'd only lasted 2 months. Their apartment stood empty, and I knew without checking that if I opened those doors, I'd find them flooded too. More figures with mops, more endless cleaning. I tried to quit, walked into the management office with my resignation letter typed and signed, but the words that came out of my mouth were different. Everything's under control, I heard myself say. Just some seasonal dampness. I'll handle it. The property manager smiled and nodded, but his eyes looked through me, unfocused and distant. There was salt in his hair. That was 3 weeks ago, or 3 months. Time moves strangely now, like tidewater, flowing in and out without clear demarcation. I still make my rounds each morning, though fewer tenants remain to need my services. The ones who've stayed don't quite look at me anymore. They step aside when I pass in the halls, pressing themselves against the walls as if I'm wider than I should be. My uniform doesn't dry properly these days. It hangs heavy on my shoulders, dripping steadily no matter how many times I wring it out. The smell follows me home. Brine and decay, soaking into my car seats, my furniture, my skin. My wife left a note saying she'd gone to her sister's, but I can't remember when I last had a wife. The photographs in my apartment show only water damage, spreading like veins across the walls. This morning I found something new in the janitor's closet, a second mop, identical to mine but older, its wooden handle soft with rot. Beside it, a bucket that wasn't there before, filled with black water that reflected no light. At the bottom, barely visible, something that might have been a brass name tag. The letters were too corroded to read, but I knew what they'd once spelled. My name, the one I'd had before, when I'd worked the docks on winter nights, keeping the wharves clean for the morning shift. The footprints in the hallway have multiplied. They lead to every door now, 4B, 4C, 4D, all of them. Behind each one, I hear the sound of sweeping, mopping, scrubbing. The building is cleaning itself, or being cleaned, or has always been cleaning. The distinction matters less each day. I've started leaving my own wet footprints. Can't help it. My boots stay soaked through, leather cracking with salt damage. I follow my usual route, checking doors, making repairs that instantly need remaking. The few remaining tenants avoid me entirely now. They know, I think, though they couldn't say what they know. Sometimes I catch my reflection in the puddles that appear in the corridors. The face looking back isn't always mine. Sometimes it's older, bearded, dressed in oilcloth and wool. Sometimes it's nothing but shadow and water, shaped into something almost human. The management office called yesterday, or last week, or never. They want to know about the water damage complaints, the exodus of tenants, the reports of strange sounds at night. I told them everything was under control, just some seasonal dampness. I'll handle it, because I will handle it. That's what I do, what I've always done. What I did then, climbing down those ice-slicked ladder rungs to help my fellow workers, hearing their calls distort across the frozen harbor. The water had looked solid, but it wasn't. It never is. It opens when it wants to swallow something, then closes again, pretending to be ice, pretending to be floor, pretending to be real. The building breathes now with a rhythm like tides. High tide brings the flooding, the footprints, the endless cleaning. Low tide offers moments of clarity where I almost remember who I was before the water took me. Before I became another thing that needs constant cleaning, constant maintenance, constant attention to stay coherent in a world that wants to dissolve. I think about the other workers sometimes, the ones who went down before me. Are they here too, in other buildings built on other buried wharves? Do they push their mops through phantom puddles, trying to clean something that can never be cleaned? Or is it just me, multiplying through the apartments like reflections in disturbed water, becoming every janitor this place has ever had or ever will have? The closet door stands open now. I can see it from here, from every here I occupy. The mops are waiting, all of them, generation after generation of wood and cotton and rust. The buckets are full of harbor water from a harbor that hasn't existed for 100 years. Someone needs to clean up all this water. Someone always has. Someone always will. I pick up the mop. My mop, their mop, the mop that existed before the building, before the land, when there was only water and the need to keep things clean. The handle fits perfectly in my hands, worn smooth by grips that might be mine. There's work to do. There's always work to do. The tide is coming in. Story 9. The first time I noticed something was wrong, I blamed it on altitude sickness. 3 weeks into my remote work arrangement in the Colorado mountains, still adjusting to the thin air and isolation. The guest room I'd converted into my office had perfect morning light. That's what I told myself mattered, not the way shadows seemed to linger in the corners even at noon, or how the floorboards creaked in patterns that suggested footsteps when I knew I was alone. It started with the bed. Every morning at 5:47 a.m., I know because I began setting my alarm for 5:45 just to watch. The sheets would smooth themselves out, not gradually, but all at once, like invisible hands were making the bed with military precision. The pillow, which I'd deliberately left askew the night before, would bear the distinct impression of a head. Not mine. I hadn't slept in that bed since converting the room. The window was worse. Each dawn brought fresh condensation on the glass, always in the same spot, always at head height if someone were standing just inside looking out. The moisture formed a perfect oval, the kind left by warm breath against cold glass. Sometimes in the very center, I could make out what looked like the bridge of a nose, the suggestion of lips. By the time the sun fully rose, it would evaporate, leaving only the faintest trace of salt residue that I could never quite clean away. My pens became their own source of dread. I'm particular about my workspace. Everything has its place, a habit from years of open office layouts where any untidiness invited judgment. But here, in my private domain, my organizational system had been hijacked. Black pens would vanish from my desk drawer only to reappear on the nightstand, arranged in perfect parallel lines. Always wet, always dripping that strange, viscous ink that seemed too thick, too dark, like it had been mixed with something else. I tried working from the kitchen, the living room, even the bathroom once in desperation, but something always drew me back to that room. Maybe it was the way my laptop seemed to run smoother there, or how my conference calls never dropped despite the spotty mountain internet, or perhaps it was something else, something that whispered at the edges of my consciousness that I belonged there, that the room had been waiting for me. The decision to sleep there came after a particularly disturbing morning. I'd left a coffee mug on the nightstand, deliberately, as a test. When I returned at dawn, the mug sat in exactly the same spot, but it was full. Not with coffee, but with water so cold it hurt my teeth when I foolishly tasted it. Water that left my mouth tasting of copper and something earthier, like soil from deep underground. That night, I prepared carefully. Fresh sheets on the bed, though touching them made my skin crawl with a revulsion I couldn't name. My laptop set up to record through the night, though I knew somehow it wouldn't capture anything. These things never do they? Whatever inhabits the spaces between what we know and what we fear always seems to understand our technology better than we do. I lay down at 11 p.m., staring at the ceiling where a water stain had been slowly spreading over the weeks, its edges forming shapes that looked different depending on the angle and the light. Sometimes a face, sometimes a map to nowhere, always watching. Sleep came in fragments. I'd drift off only to wake with the certainty that someone was standing at the foot of the bed. But when I'd force my eyes open, the room would be empty except for shadows that seemed too solid, too purposeful. The temperature dropped steadily through the night, my breath misting in the air despite the thermostat reading a steady 68 degrees. At 3 a.m. I heard it, a sound like fabric being pulled taut, like sheets being stretched across a mattress. But I was lying on top of the covers, hadn't moved. The sound came from beneath the bed. I wanted to look, needed to look, but my body wouldn't respond. Sleep paralysis, I told myself, though I'd never experienced it before. Just sleep paralysis and altitude and isolation playing tricks. The sound shifted, became something wetter, like someone wringing out cloth that had been soaked through. Drip, drip, drip. Onto wood that shouldn't have been there. The floor was carpeted. I could feel the vibrations through the mattress. Each drop a small percussion that seemed to sync with my heartbeat, until I couldn't tell which was which. When I finally forced myself to move, to lean over the edge of the bed and look beneath, I found it. The suitcase. Old leather, the kind they don't make anymore, with brass clasps that had turned green with age. It was open, gaping like a mouth, and it was empty. But the interior was wet, soaked through with that same dark liquid that my pens leaked. As I watched, frozen, a drop fell from somewhere above, from the mattress, through the mattress, and landed inside with a sound that was almost like a sigh. I pulled the suitcase out, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the handle. It was heavier than it should have been for something empty, and it left a trail of moisture across the carpet that disappeared even as I watched. The luggage tag, yellowed and water-spotted, bore initials that weren't mine but felt familiar in a way that made my stomach turn. JTM. Inside the suitcase, pressed into the wet lining, I found an impression. The shape of objects that should have been there. Clothes, perhaps, toiletries, the mundane artifacts of travel, but also something else. The outline of fingers, pressed deep into the fabric like someone had tried to claw their way out from inside. I set the suitcase on the nightstand and watched as my pens began to move on their own, arranging themselves around it like iron filings around a magnet. They leaked faster now, the ink pooling and running in rivulets that formed letters I couldn't quite read, words in a language that seemed just beyond comprehension. The window fogged again, though it was the middle of the night and I was alone. This time, though, the condensation formed on the inside of the glass. As I watched, transfixed, a finger, or something like a finger, began to write in the moisture, backwards, so I could read it from where I stood. Checking out. The letters dripped, ran, reformed, checking in, and then, finally, never left. I grabbed my laptop, my phone, abandoned everything else, and fled the room. But as I reached the door, my feet tangled in something. I looked down to find clothes scattered across the floor, men's clothes, decades out of style, still damp as if they'd just been pulled from that impossible suitcase. A wallet lay among them, leather cracked with age. Inside, a driver's license so faded I could barely make out the photo. But the face looked like mine. Would look like mine in 20 years, maybe 30. The name was different, but the eyes were the same. The expires date, 1987. I've moved my office to the kitchen now. I tell myself it's for the better light, the proximity to coffee, the view of the mountains. Not because I can't stand to be in that room anymore. Not because every morning I still hear the sounds of someone getting ready for work in there. Shower running, though the guest bathroom has been dry for weeks. Closet doors opening and closing. The distinctive sound of a zipper on a suitcase that shouldn't exist. But the worst part, the thing that keeps me awake in my own bedroom now, is that my productivity has plummeted. My code won't compile. My video calls drop constantly. My emails arrive hours late or not at all. It's as if the room wants me back, needs me there. As if I'm not the first remote worker to set up in that space, and whoever was there before never really logged off. Yesterday I found a note in my handwriting that I don't remember writing. It was on my desk in the kitchen, written on paper I don't own with one of those perpetually dripping pens. The commute is killing me. Below that, in different handwriting, older, more formal, it already did. This morning I woke up in the guest room. I don't remember going there. The bed was perfectly made around me, hospital corners and military precision. The suitcase sat open on the floor, no longer empty. Inside were clothes that looked exactly like mine, but older, worn in places I haven't worn mine yet. A laptop that was my model but running software from before it was invented. A coffee mug, still warm, with lipstick stains on the rim, though I live alone and always have. The window was fogged again. This time the message was clearer. Welcome home. I've stopped trying to leave the room during work hours. It's easier this way. My productivity is back up. My calls crystal clear. My code compiles on the first try, every time. I tell myself it's just until I can find another place, break the lease, move somewhere with better light and fewer shadows. But sometimes, late at night, I catch myself looking in the mirror and seeing someone else looking back. Someone older, more tired, wearing clothes that went out of style decades ago. Someone who's been working from home for so long they've forgotten what the office looked like, what the outside looks like, what anything looks like except these four walls and that perpetually foggy window. The suitcase is filling up. Every day, something of mine appears inside it. My favorite mug, a shoe, a photograph I don't remember taking of a house I've never lived in but recognize with a certainty that makes my bones ache. Soon, I think, it will be full, ready for a trip to somewhere or from somewhere or both at once. I've started making the bed myself now every morning at 5:47 a.m. It feels right, natural, like I've been doing it for years, decades, longer. The pillow holds the impression of my head perfectly, as if it was always meant to. As if every head that ever rested there was always mine, or became mine, or will become mine. The pens don't drip anymore. The ink flows smooth and dark when I write, forming words in handwriting that shifts between mine and something older, something that remembers when remote work meant something different, meant never leaving, meant checking in and never checking out. I should be frightened. I was frightened. But fear, like everything else in this room, has become routine. Another part of the daily stand-up, another task on the never-ending sprint, another feature, not a bug, in the system that runs beneath the surface of working from home, in a house that was never quite empty, in a room that was always occupied, with a commute that ended before it began. Tomorrow, I've decided, I'll open the suitcase and pack properly, or unpack. I'm no longer sure which direction I'm traveling, or if I'm traveling at all. Maybe I never was. Maybe none of us ever leave. We just check in, set up our workstations, and discover that the real remote work is the distance between who we were and who we become in rooms that remember every occupant, every morning, every drop of ink that was really something else entirely. The window is fogging again. This time, I don't need to read the message. I'm the one writing it. From the inside, from the outside, from the place between where the commute never ends and never began. I am home. I've always been home. And somewhere, in another time or the same time folded differently, another remote worker is setting up their office in a guest room in Colorado, noticing how perfect the morning light is, how the shadows linger, how their pens have started to drip. The cycle continues. The commute never ends. The suitcase is patient. It always has been. Story 10. The building at 447 Spruce Street had been watching me long before I started watching back. I'd moved into the third-floor apartment 6 months ago, drawn by the crown molding and original hardwood floors that real estate listings love to flaunt. Built in 1922, the narrow Philadelphia row house retained what the agent called period charm. Exposed brick walls, brass fixtures gone green with age, and a staircase that groaned like ship timbers in a storm. The rent was suspiciously reasonable for Center City, but I'd attributed that to the lack of modern amenities and the fact that heat barely reached the third floor in winter. I should have known better. In this city of Benjamin Franklin and yellow fever, of Eastern State Penitentiary and unmarked graves beneath Independence Mall, buildings accumulate more than just dust and history. They accumulate intent. The first incident happened 3 weeks after I'd settled in. I woke at 3:17 a.m. I remember the exact time because the red digits on my alarm clock seemed unnaturally bright in the darkness. The building was breathing around me, settling into itself with clicks and sighs that old structures make. But underneath that familiar symphony was something else. Footsteps on the stairs. Slow, deliberate, each creak perfectly timed, as if someone was savoring the journey upward. I lay still, every muscle taut, listening as the steps ascended from the first floor. The couple in 2B had complained about thin walls when I'd moved in, warning me I'd hear everything. But they worked hospital shifts and were rarely home at night. The first floor apartment had been empty for months. The footsteps paused at the second floor landing. I held my breath, waiting for them to continue down the hallway to 2B, but they didn't. After a moment that stretched like pulled taffy, they resumed their climb. Creak, pause, creak, pause. My mouth went dry. The digital clock cast everything in a hellish red glow. My dresser, the stack of unopened moving boxes, the thin line of light beneath my door. The footsteps reached the third floor landing and stopped directly outside my apartment. I waited for a knock, for the doorknob to turn, for something. Nothing. After what might have been 5 minutes or 50, I forced myself out of bed and crept to the door. The peephole showed an empty hallway bathed in the sickly yellow light of the single bulb that never quite illuminated the corners. I pressed my ear to the door. Silence. When I finally worked up the courage to open it, the hallway was empty, but the air was different, thicker, colder, with a smell like wet copper and old newspapers. I told myself it was another tenant, maybe someone visiting 2B who'd gotten confused in the dark. The explanation felt tissue-thin even then, but I clung to it through the following weeks as the incidents accumulated like water damage spreading through plaster. The hallway lights began failing in sequence, not all at once. That would have been electrical, explainable. Instead, they died one by one, starting from the stairwell and advancing toward my door like something walking the hall and extinguishing them with its presence. I'd stand at my peephole, watching the darkness creep closer, until only the bulb directly outside my apartment remained lit, flickering but holding like a last defensive position. By morning, they'd all be working again. The building's super, An elderly Polish man who communicated primarily through disapproving grunts claimed he'd never needed to replace those bulbs. Good bulbs, he'd said, tapping one with his wrench. From before, they built things to last. He'd looked at me strangely then, as if seeing something in my face that confirmed a private suspicion. Then came the matter of my keys. I'm not a careless person. My keys lived in a ceramic bowl by the door, apartment key, mailbox key, bike lock key, and a small brass key whose purpose I'd forgotten but kept out of habit. One morning, the brass key was missing. I searched everywhere, convinced I'd knocked it out of the bowl somehow. 3 days later, I found it hanging from the second-floor stair railing, covered in condensation despite the building's oppressive dryness. It was cold to the touch, so cold it burned my fingers. The next time my mailbox key disappeared. I found it a week later, threaded through the mail slot of the empty first-floor apartment. This time it wasn't just wet. It was dripping, though with what I couldn't say. The liquid was clear but viscous, clinging to the metal like syrup. I started keeping my keys in my pocket at all times, even sleeping with them under my pillow. It didn't matter. They'd still vanish, only to reappear in increasingly disturbing locations, balanced on my doorknob when I knew I'd locked it from the inside, arranged in a perfect line on the hallway floor, and once, horrifyingly, inside my refrigerator, frosted over as if they'd been there for days. The woman in 2B moved out abruptly in November. I helped her carry boxes down the narrow stairs, and she kept glancing over her shoulder, flinching at shadows. "You ever hear things?" she asked as we reached the street. I hesitated. "Sometimes." She nodded quickly, too quickly. "It's an old building. Makes noise." But her eyes said something different. They said run. Winter arrived early and bitter, and with it came a new development. The wet footprints started appearing in December, always after the 3 a.m. visits. I'd wake to the familiar creaking ascent, lie frozen as the presence stopped outside my door, and in the morning find puddles on the landing. Not water. The liquid was too thick, too dark, leaving rusty stains on the old wood. The prints led up to my door and stopped, toes pointed toward the apartment as if someone had stood there waiting. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that some mornings, the footprints faced the other direction, as if whatever left them had stood with its back to my door, watching the stairwell, guarding or waiting for something else. I started documenting everything. Photos of the footprints that somehow never quite captured their wrongness. Audio recordings of the footsteps that played back as nothing but static. Notes about the growing cold spot outside my door, the way my breath misted in the hallway even when the ancient radiators clanged with heat. My sleep fractured. I'd doze fitfully until 3 a.m., then lie awake, muscles clenched, waiting. The footsteps came every night now, sometimes stopping at my door, sometimes continuing past to pace the small landing. Once I heard what sounded like fingernails dragging along my door, a slow, deliberate scratching that lasted until dawn. The isolation was suffocating. The first-floor apartment remained empty. After the woman fled 2B, her roommate lasted 2 weeks before leaving without notice. The super stopped coming around. Even delivery drivers seemed reluctant to climb the stairs, leaving packages in the vestibule and fleeing. I should have left. Every rational part of my brain screamed to break the lease, to run like the woman from 2B. But something held me there, not physical force, but a terrible curiosity. I needed to know what wanted in, what stood outside my door night after night, patient as erosion. So I planned. I would confront it. On a freezing Thursday night in late December, I prepared. I placed a camera in the hallway, hidden behind a dying potted plant the previous tenant had abandoned. I sprinkled flour on the landing to capture footprints. I waited by the door with my phone ready, hand on the deadbolt. 3 a.m. came and went. No footsteps. 3:17 a.m. Nothing. By 4 a.m., exhaustion was pulling at me like an undertow. I checked the hallway. The flower was undisturbed, the camera still recording nothing but an empty landing. Defeated, I returned to bed. I woke at 7 a.m. to find my apartment door wide open. Not forced, not broken, simply open, as if I'd forgotten to close it. The camera was gone. The flower remained pristine, untouched. But there were wet footprints inside my apartment now, leading from the door to the foot of my bed where they stopped. The impressions in the carpet were still damp, still cold. Something had been watching me sleep. I left that day, threw everything I could fit into my car and drove to a friend's place in Jersey. But even now, weeks later, I can't shake the feeling that I'm missing something crucial. The footprints that faced away from my door haunt me most. That defensive posture, that vigilant stance. What if whatever climbed those stairs each night wasn't trying to get in? What if it was trying to keep something else out? Last night in my new apartment across the river, I woke at 3:17 a.m. to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. Slow, deliberate. But this time, they were descending, moving away from my door with what sounded almost like reluctance. And in the morning, I found my keys, the ones from the old apartment that I'd thrown away, hanging from my doorknob, ice cold and dripping with something that wasn't quite water. The brass key was missing. I think about that empty first-floor apartment at 447 Spruce Street, about whatever might have lived there before the building was erected in 1922, when Philadelphia was younger and hungrier and built on foundations nobody talks about anymore. I think about the defensive stance of those wet footprints, facing outward like a guard. And late at night, when I can't sleep, I wonder what would have happened if I'd opened the door, if I'd acknowledged whatever kept vigil outside my apartment, if I'd understood that some thresholds aren't meant to keep things out, but to keep them in. The building still emails me through the rental portal, automated messages about maintenance and lease renewal. But sometimes, between the standard text, there are extra characters that shouldn't be there. They look random at first. Keyboard smashes, glitches in the system. But when I arrange them differently, they form words. Still watching, still waiting door opens both ways. I've stopped checking my email at night. Sometimes I dream about the brass key, the one whose purpose I'd forgotten. In the dreams, I remember what it opens. A door in the basement of 447 Spruce Street. A door that was sealed before the building was constructed. A door that exists in the space between the foundation and what came before. In the dreams, something whispers that the footsteps were never trying to reach me. They were trying to warn me. They were trying to keep me from going downstairs. My new apartment is on the ground floor. I told myself it was for convenience, for easy access to the parking lot. But I know the truth. I can't bear the sound of footsteps on stairs anymore. Each creak is a countdown. Each groan a reminder that some things follow you not through space, but through the architecture of your fear. The wet footprints have started appearing here too. Not every night, but often enough. They lead to my door and stop, toes pointed inward now, as if whatever leaves them has finally gained entry to where it wanted to be. Or maybe it's something else entirely. Maybe those backward-facing prints at the old building were never standing guard. Maybe they were facing something that had already gotten inside, something that stood behind me in my apartment all those nights, breathing in the darkness just outside my bedroom, waiting for me to understand that the real horror wasn't what wanted to get in, it was what was already there. The brass key appeared on my nightstand this morning, tarnished and cold. I know I should throw it away, but I can't bring myself to touch it. It sits there like an invitation or a threat, and I no longer know which would be worse. Because now I understand the truth about 447 Spruce Street, about old buildings in old cities where the past never quite stops bleeding through. The footsteps weren't the haunting, they were the warning. And I, in my infinite wisdom, in my need to document and understand and rationalize, had missed the only message that mattered. Some doors should never be opened, and some are already open, waiting in the spaces we refuse to see, in the corners our eyes skip over, in the darkness that pools beneath our beds and behind our eyelids. I still wake at 3:17 a.m. every night, not to footsteps now, but to silence. A silence so complete it feels like the world is holding its breath. And in that silence, I sometimes hear something else. The slow, patient turning of a key in a lock that doesn't exist in any floor plan, in any blueprint, in any version of reality I'm prepared to accept. The building at 447 Spruce Street is still sending me messages. Not emails anymore, but something else. Patterns in the static of my radio, shapes in the steam on my bathroom mirror, arrangements of leaves on my windshield that spell out words I pretend not to read. They all say the same thing. Come back. The door is already open. I won't go back. I can't. But late at night, when the silence becomes unbearable and the walls feel too thin and the darkness too thick, I hold that brass key and wonder what would happen if I did. If I descended those stairs I've climbed so many times in my nightmares, if I found that door that exists between what was built and what was buried, if I finally understood what those wet footprints were trying to tell me, maybe the real horror isn't that something was trying to get in. Maybe it's that something was trying to get out. And maybe, this is the thought that wakes me gasping at 3:17 a.m. every night. Maybe it already has. Story 11. The first time I noticed the smell, I thought a pipe had burst somewhere. That briny, thick scent of seawater seeping through my garage walls at 3 in the morning had me stumbling out of bed, flashlight in hand, expecting to find my workbench floating in a pool of backed-up sewage. But the concrete floor was bone dry, and the smell vanished the moment I flicked on the overhead fluorescent. I should have moved out then. Should have packed everything into boxes and driven away from Seattle, from that house on the hill with its perfect view of Elliott Bay, 20 miles from the actual water. But the mortgage was reasonable, the commute was short, and I told myself I was being ridiculous. Old houses smell weird sometimes. That's what I told myself. The garage had always felt wrong, even during the daytime walkthrough with the realtor. She'd hurried us through it, her heels clicking fast against the concrete, her smile stretched thin when I asked about the previous owners. Relocated, she'd said, then quickly directed my attention to the newly renovated kitchen. I remember how her hand trembled slightly as she pulled the garage door shut behind us. 3 weeks after I moved in, the tools started rearranging themselves. Not dramatically, just subtle shifts that made me question my memory. The hammer I distinctly remembered hanging on the left peg would be on the right. The box of screws I'd organized by size would be mixed together. The level I'd left on the workbench would be propped against the wall, its bubble floating lazily in green liquid that seemed too thick, too viscous. Then the radio started its midnight concerts. It was my grandfather's radio, a 1960s Zenith that hadn't worked since before he died. I kept it on the shelf for sentimental reasons. Its cloth speaker cover yellowed with age, its chrome dials frozen with decades of dust. But at 3:17 a.m., always 3:17 a.m., it would crackle to life with static that sounded wet, organic, like breathing through water. I'd lie in bed, paralyzed by something between sleep and terror, listening to that static. Sometimes I could hear patterns in it, rhythmic pulses that reminded me of waves against a hull, or the slow drip of water in a cave. Once I could have sworn I heard voices, distant and garbled, speaking in languages that predated words. The morning I found the bucket changed everything. I'd left it empty the night before, I was certain. I'd used it to wash my car, turned it upside down to dry, left it in the corner where I always did. But there it sat in the center of the garage floor, filled halfway with water that shouldn't exist. The overhead light reflected off its surface in patterns that hurt to follow, geometric impossibilities that made my eyes water. Floating in that impossible water was my pen, the one I'd lost 3 months ago at the office, the one with my initials engraved on the clip. It moved in slow circles, trailing ink that dispersed in ribbons of blue-black, writing messages in a language I couldn't read but somehow felt in my bones. I reached for it without thinking, my fingers breaking the surface tension. The water was warm, body temperature, and had the consistency of amniotic fluid. The pen slipped through my grasp, diving deep into water that couldn't possibly be contained by a bucket only 18 inches deep. My hand followed, then my wrist, then my forearm, reaching down into spaces that violated every law of physics I understood. That's when I felt the other hand brush against mine. I yanked my arm back so violently I fell onto the concrete, scrambling backward until my back hit the wall. The bucket sat there, innocent, the water still except for tiny ripples that moved against any current, ripples that formed patterns, that spelled things, that knew things. I started sleeping in my car after that, parking it at the far end of the driveway. But every morning, I'd wake to find it back in the garage, engine cold, keys in the ignition, the radio playing that wet static. The rearview mirror would be adjusted to show me angles of the garage I'd never noticed, corners that seemed to extend too far, shadows that moved independent of their sources. The smell grew stronger each night, that ocean rot mixing with something else, ozone and copper and the peculiar scent of deep sea pressure. I'd find pools of water in impossible places, inside sealed paint cans, between the pages of old magazines, beading on the ceiling in patterns that resembled star charts of constellations that don't exist in our sky. I tried to research the house's history, but the records were sparse, confused, contradictory. The lot had been empty, then it hadn't. The house was built in 1953 or 1897 or never. The previous owners had moved or disappeared or never existed at all. The only consistent detail was a note in a water-damaged file at the city planning office. Basement sealed, 1971. Do not excavate. My house doesn't have a basement. I checked. I measured. I compared the interior dimensions to the exterior. The math worked out perfectly. There was no basement. But sometimes, standing in the garage at 3:17 a.m., listening to that radio breathe its static, I could hear something beneath the concrete. A rhythmic thudding like a heart, or like waves against a hull, or like something vast and patient trying to remember how to knock. The breaking point came 6 weeks ago. I woke not in my car, not in my bed, but standing knee-deep in water in the garage. The concrete floor had become permeable, soft, like standing on the surface tension of a vertical ocean. Below me, through me, I could see depths that shouldn't exist. Shapes moved in that darkness, architectural impossibilities that might have been rooms, or might have been organs in something so large that distinction became meaningless. The tools floated around me in slow orbits, each one drawing those same circular patterns my pen had traced. The radio played clearly now, voices speaking in harmonics that human throats couldn't produce, describing things that would happen, had happened, were happening now in spaces perpendicular to time. I wanted to run, but the water held me with a pressure that wasn't physical. It was the weight of recognition, of remembering something I'd never forgotten but had never known. My reflection in that impossible water wasn't quite right. Too many fingers, eyes that had seen depths where light becomes theoretical, a mouth that had breathed in media thicker than air. Then I saw the others. They stood in their own garages, in their own pools of vertical water, all up and down my street, throughout Seattle, throughout everywhere coastal cities press against the membrane between what is and what waits. We were all standing in the same water, the same garage, the same moment that stretches from 317 to 317, breathing static and salt. The woman next door, whom I'd never seen before but had always known, turned to me with eyes full of brine and understanding. Her lips moved, and the radio translated, "The tide rises from below." I understood then that basements weren't sealed to keep us out. They were sealed to keep something in, something that had been here before the city, before the land, before the distinction between water and air meant anything, something that waited in spaces between spaces, patient as erosion, inevitable as the moon's pull on the tide. I pulled myself out somehow, not physically, but sideways, perpendicular to the direction of drowning. I found myself gasping on dry concrete, the garage normal except for the puddle beneath me that reflected depths instead of ceiling. The tools hung in their proper places. The radio sat silent. The bucket was empty and upright in its corner. But I know it's still happening. Every night at 3:17, I exist in two states, here in my bed and there in the garage, knee-deep in impossible water, breathing static with lungs that remember being gills. The boundaries are thinning. Each morning, I find more of the ocean in my house, salt crystals in the coffee maker, seaweed in the air vents, barnacles growing in perfect spirals on the bathroom mirror. Yesterday, I found a nautical chart in my desk drawer at work, one I don't remember putting there. It shows the Puget Sound, but wrong, deeper, older, extending inland in ways that violate geography. My house is marked with an X, labeled in handwriting that might be mine. Tide room, depth, unfathomable. The realtor called today, said she was checking in, seeing how I was enjoying the house. Her voice crackled with static, wet and electric. She asked if I'd noticed anything unusual about the garage. When I didn't answer, she laughed. Or maybe it was just the sound of water draining through spaces too small to measure. The previous owners figured it out eventually, she said, her words dissolving into frequencies that hurt to parse. They learned to swim in directions that don't exist. The tide always returns what it takes, just not in shapes we recognize. I hung up, but the dial tone sounded like waves. Now I sit here writing this, and I can smell it again. That thick brine, that deep-sea pressure converted to scent. The tools are moving in the garage. I can hear them clinking in patterns that spell out inevitabilities. The radio is warming up, its tubes glowing with bioluminescent possibilities. It's 3:16 a.m. In 1 minute, I'll be in two places at once. Here, holding on to the fiction of dry land, and there, in the tide room, learning that drowning isn't about water at all. It's about remembering that we were something else before we convinced ourselves we were human, and that the ocean never forgot our true names. The pen is moving again, writing this story in water that doesn't exist, in handwriting that isn't quite mine anymore. Each word ripples outward, reaching through dimensions toward other garages, other impossible basements, other people standing knee-deep in vertical seas. I should leave Seattle. I should run. But running requires believing in the difference between here and there, between wet and dry, between what's beneath the concrete and what's beneath that. And every night at 3:17 I understand a little more clearly that those distinctions were only ever polite fictions we told ourselves to keep the tide at bay. The static is getting louder now, resolving into voices, into languages older than land. They're saying something about depth, about pressure, about how the moon pulls more than just water. They're saying that every garage in Seattle, maybe every garage everywhere, is the same garage, the same room where the tide rises from below. My watch reads 3:17. I'm already standing in the water. I've always been standing in the water. The radio plays the sound of my own voice, speaking from depths I haven't reached yet, describing things I'll understand when I stop pretending I'm separate from the tide. The pen keeps writing, but the words are in water now, dissolving as they form, true only in the moment of their drowning. Story 12. The loft had seemed perfect when I'd first walked through it 6 weeks ago. Exposed brick walls, soaring ceilings with original tin tiles, and those massive factory windows that flooded the space with light during the day. The realtor had been almost apologetic about the 12 wooden boxes stacked in the corner, each one marked with a fading number painted in white. Previous tenant left them, she'd explained with a nervous laugh that didn't quite reach her eyes. Building management says you can toss them if you want. But I hadn't tossed them. Something about their precise arrangement, 3 rows of 4, perfectly aligned despite their obvious age, made them feel intentional, permanent, like they'd been waiting there long before the previous tenant, maybe even before the building's conversion from a textile factory in the 1920s. That first night, I'd barely noticed them. Exhausted from the move, I'd collapsed onto my mattress on the floor and fallen into a dreamless sleep. But at exactly 3 a.m., I woke to a sound like sandpaper dragging across wood. Slow, deliberate, the kind of sound that makes your spine compress and your breathing shallow out to nothing. I lay there, muscles locked, listening to that terrible scraping echo through the loft's open space. It lasted maybe 30 seconds, though time moves differently in the dark when you're afraid, before cutting off abruptly. I told myself it was the radiator, the building settling. Anything but what it sounded like, something being dragged across my floor. The next morning, I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. Almost. Until I walked past the boxes and noticed that number 7 had moved. Not far, maybe 6 inches forward, but enough to break the perfect grid they'd formed. I stood there, coffee mug warming my hands, staring at that gap in the pattern like it was a wound. I pushed the box back into place. My hands shook slightly as I did it, and I noticed how cold the wood felt, despite the morning sun streaming through the windows. There was something else too. A smell, faint but distinct. Salt water. Brine. Like the ocean, but wrong somehow. Stagnant. The second night, I was ready. I set up my phone to record, positioned myself on the couch with a clear view of the boxes, and waited. 2:45 a.m., 2:50, 2:55. My eyes burned from staring, but I refused to blink. 3 o'clock. The dragging sound began immediately, but this time it was accompanied by something worse. A wet, rhythmic padding, like bare feet on damp concrete. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The sounds seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, filling the loft with their wrongness. My phone screen had gone black. Dead battery, though I'd charged it to full just hours before. When morning came, box number 2 had shifted. But that wasn't the worst part. Leading from where the box had been to its new position were footprints. Wet footprints that glistened in the early light, already beginning to evaporate at the edges. They were almost human, but the proportions were wrong, too long, with what looked like webbing between the toes. I spent that entire day researching the building's history. The New York Public Library's archives revealed that before its conversion, the factory had employed mostly immigrant workers. There had been an accident in 1923, a fire that trapped 12 workers in the basement during a night shift. They'd broken through a wall trying to escape and discovered an old tunnel system that predated the building. The tunnel had flooded. All 12 had drowned in the dark underground water. But that wasn't what made my hands tremble as I read. It was the date. They died on November 3rd. Today was October 15th. In my growing paranoia, I did the math. 19 days until the anniversary. That night, the third night, I couldn't bring myself to sleep in the loft. I sat in an all-night diner 3 blocks away, nursing coffee after coffee, watching the clock. At 3 a.m. exactly, my phone buzzed with a motion alert from the security camera I'd installed that afternoon. The footage was corrupted, just static and strange, wave-like patterns that hurt to look at. When I returned at dawn, box number 11 had moved. The wet footprints were everywhere now, crisscrossing the floor in seemingly random patterns. But as I stood there, something in my peripheral vision made them resolve into something else. A map. They were tracing the outline of rooms that didn't exist in my loft. Basement rooms, maybe. Or tunnels. I should have left then, packed everything and broken the lease. But something held me there. A compulsion I couldn't name. That afternoon I examined the boxes more carefully. They were old, definitely from the 1920s based on the construction. Each one was locked with a different type of padlock, all extensively rusted, except for box number 3. That lock was bright and new, like it had been replaced recently. I cut it with bolt cutters I'd bought from the hardware store. My hands wouldn't stop shaking as I lifted the lid. Inside was my passport. The same passport I'd lost 3 months ago, before I'd even known this loft existed. It was damp, pages wrinkled with moisture, and tucked inside was a piece of paper. The ink had run, making the words barely legible, but I could make out, "Falta pouco." I don't speak Portuguese, but Google Translate told me what I'd already somehow known. Not long now. The next few nights blurred together into a waking nightmare. The sounds grew louder, more insistent. The dragging became violent thrashing. The footsteps multiplied until it sounded like a crowd moving through my loft. I stopped sleeping entirely, living on coffee and fear. The boxes moved in increasingly complex patterns, and I began finding things inside them. Things that shouldn't exist. Box 5 contained a water-damaged photograph of me as a child, standing next to a man I didn't recognize, in front of a building that looked exactly like my loft. But I'd grown up in Ohio, had never been to New York before this year. Box 9 held a set of keys that fit locks in my apartment that I hadn't known existed. A hidden compartment in the floor, a panel in the bathroom wall. Behind each was more evidence of water damage, more salt smell, more wrongness. Box 1 was the worst. Inside was a handwritten journal, pages thick with mold, documenting someone's gradual descent into madness. The handwriting looked like mine, but the dates were from 1923. The final entry just repeated the same phrase over and over. They're coming up through the water. They're coming up through the water. They're coming up through the water. I started seeing things during the day. Shadows in the periphery that moved like they were underwater. Reflections in the windows that showed too many people in my loft. The sound of dripping that had no source. On October 28th, I woke up, if I'd ever really been asleep, to find all 12 boxes arranged in a circle in the middle of my floor. The wet footprints spiraled inward from each box to a central point where the floorboards were beginning to buckle and warp. Something was pushing up from below. I called the landlord, but the number was disconnected. The realtor's office had no record of my lease. According to the building management company, my unit had been vacant since a tenant disappeared 3 months ago. They'd found only his passport, waterlogged and abandoned. The rational part of my mind, what's left of it, knows this is impossible. I know I signed a lease. I know I've been living here. I have receipts, furniture, a life, but every piece of evidence I try to show someone either disappears or transforms into something else. My bank statements show no rent payments. My friends have no memory of helping me move. The photos I took of the apartment that first day show empty rooms filled with standing water. November 2nd now. Tomorrow is the anniversary. The boxes haven't moved in 3 days, but the water damage is spreading. The walls weep with condensation that tastes of salt. The floorboards groan with a weight that shouldn't exist. And the footprints, they're not appearing on the floor anymore. They're appearing on the ceiling, on the walls, tracking impossible paths through three-dimensional space. I found something else in box 3 today, underneath where my passport had been. Another note, dry this time, in handwriting that might be mine. You were the 12th. You were always the 12th. I've started having memories that aren't mine, of working in a factory, of the smell of textile dust, of a fire starting, smoke filling my lungs, of breaking through a brick wall in desperate panic, of water, black and cold, rushing in, of drowning in the dark, while something that lived in that water wrapped around my ankles and pulled. But I'm from Ohio. I'm 28 years old. I work in tech. I moved to New York for a fresh start after, I can't remember what came before. Can't remember why I needed a fresh start. Can't remember anything except this loft and these boxes and the certainty that tomorrow on November 3rd at 3 a.m., something is going to complete a cycle that started long before I was born. Or maybe exactly when I was born. Or maybe I was never born at all. The water stains on the ceiling have formed words now. Portuguese words. Bem-vindo de volta. Welcome back. I've stopped trying to leave. The door doesn't open anymore. Not because it's locked, but because behind it is just more loft, stretching infinitely in all directions. The windows show not New York, but an underwater city, buildings swaying like kelp in invisible currents. Sometimes I see figures floating past, pressed against the glass. Their faces familiar, but wrong. Sometimes one of them is wearing my face. Tonight is the last night. I can feel it in the way the air has thickened, taken on the pressure of deep water. The boxes are humming now, a low vibration that makes my teeth ache. The footprints are everywhere, overlapping into a solid sheet of moisture that climbs the walls like a living thing. I've been writing this to leave some record, some evidence that I existed, that I was real. But even as I write, I watch the words change, rearrange themselves into Portuguese, into languages I don't recognize, into symbols that hurt to perceive. Nothing stays, nothing holds. The clock on my phone, when it works, keeps showing times that don't exist. 25:73, 3:33:33. Sometimes it just shows an infinity symbol, pulsing like a heartbeat. I think I understand now. The 12 boxes weren't left by the previous tenant. They are the previous tenants. All of them. And tomorrow, when the clock strikes 3 a.m., when the anniversary completes another revolution, I'll take my place in the pattern. Box 12 has always been empty. waiting. The man in the photograph from box 5. I remember him now. He was me in 1923. He was me in 1847 when this was still wetland, still marsh. He was me when the Dutch first claimed this island, when something in the water made a bargain that echoes through time. Or maybe none of this is real. Maybe I'm having a psychotic break, and tomorrow I'll wake up in a hospital, medicated and safe. Maybe the carbon monoxide detector I never bought would be screaming warnings if it existed. Maybe the mold growing in the walls is releasing hallucinogenic spores. But the water is rising now. It's seeping through the floorboards, impossible and real. Salt thick and older than the city above it. The boxes are opening one by one, releasing sounds that aren't quite voices, aren't quite drowning gasps, aren't quite singing. 3 a.m. is coming. It's always coming. It's always been here. I was always the 12th. Falta poco. Not long now. Story 13. The first time I heard furniture scraping across the floor above me at 3 in the morning, I convinced myself it was the building settling. Old Minneapolis apartments make noise. Everyone knows that. The radiators clang, the pipes groan, the wooden floors creak with temperature changes. But furniture doesn't move itself, and apartment 2B had been vacant for 3 months. I'd lived directly below in 1B for 2 years without incident. The previous tenant of 2B had been an elderly woman who barely made a sound. When she moved to assisted living in August, the landlord mentioned he was having trouble filling the unit. Something about water damage that needed repairs. By November, with winter settling over the city like a thick blanket of ice and silence, 2B remained empty, or so I was told. The scraping came again the following night, a deliberate sound like someone dragging a heavy dresser across bare floorboards. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, watching the light fixture tremble slightly with each pull. My digital clock read 3:17 a.m. I waited, breathing shallow, counting the seconds between movements. 23, 24, then another long, grinding pull that made my teeth ache. I called the landlord the next morning. He seemed confused, insisted 2B was still vacant, and promised to check for intruders. When I came home from work that evening, I found a note slipped under my door. Checked, 2B. No signs of entry. Door locked, dust undisturbed. Maybe sound traveling from another unit? Management. But sound doesn't travel through floors the way water does. The water started 3 nights later. Not a leak exactly. More like someone had left a faucet running. I could hear it through the walls, a steady stream that seemed to move from room to room above me. At first, just a trickle, barely audible over the hum of my refrigerator. By 4 in the morning it had become a torrent, and I watched in growing horror as dark spots began forming on my ceiling, spreading like ink through paper. I grabbed a bucket, then another, positioning them under the worst spots. The water that dripped down was ice cold and had an odd metallic smell that reminded me of old pennies. It left rust-colored stains on everything it touched. When I pressed my palm against the ceiling, the plaster felt soft, almost flesh-warm despite the cold water seeping through. The landlord didn't answer his emergency line. I left 3 messages, each more frantic than the last. By morning the water had stopped, but my ceiling looked like a topographical map of some alien landscape, all bulges and dark continents of moisture. That's when I decided to investigate 2B myself. The hallway outside my apartment always felt colder than it should, as if heat couldn't quite penetrate the space. The fluorescent lights flickered intermittently, casting jumping shadows that made the familiar corridor seem longer than usual. I climbed the stairs slowly, each step creaking under my weight. The brass numbers on 2B's door had tarnished to near black, and the doormat, which I'd never noticed before, was soaking wet despite no visible water source. I knocked. The sound seemed to disappear into the door, absorbed rather than echoed. I knocked again, harder. Nothing. I pressed my ear against the wood and heard, or thought I heard, breathing on the other side. Slow, deliberate breaths that matched my own rhythm. When I held my breath, the breathing stopped too. I practically ran back to my apartment. locking the door behind me and shoving a chair under the handle. My hands shook as I poured myself a drink, trying to rationalize what I'd experienced. Acoustic tricks, my imagination, stress from work manifesting as paranoia. The explanations felt thin, desperate. That night, something new happened. I woke not to sounds but to silence, a complete unnatural absence of noise that made my ears ring. Even the ever-present hum of the city had vanished. I reached for my phone. 3:33 a.m. The numbers glowed too bright in the darkness, leaving green after images when I blinked. Then I saw it. On my kitchen table, where I'd left nothing before bed, sat a water glass. Not one of mine. The glass was old, made of thick green Depression-era glass that distorted the light passing through it. It was full to the brim with that same metallic-smelling water, and wrapped around it were wet fingerprints that didn't match my own. They were too long, the fingers that made them impossibly thin. I didn't touch the glass. I sat in my living room chair, watching it until sunrise, as if it might move. When dawn finally came, weak and gray through my windows, the glass was gone. Only a perfectly circular water stain remained on the table's surface, already beginning to warp the wood. The next few days I found more objects. My watch, which I'd lost months ago, appeared on the doormat of 2B, dripping wet and running backward. A book I'd been reading showed up there too, the pages fused together with moisture, the words bleeding into incomprehensible patterns. Each morning brought another item, another piece of my life regurgitated onto that perpetually wet doormat. I started sleeping during the day, staying awake all night to monitor the sounds above. The furniture moving had become rhythmic, almost dance-like. Drag, drag, pause. Drag, drag, pause. Sometimes I heard what sounded like bare feet slapping against wet floor, moving in circles. The water sounds evolved too, no longer just running faucets, but splashing, as if someone were bathing, washing, drowning, over and over again. I decided to test something. Before going to bed one night, day really, as it was 2 p.m., I placed a glass of water in front of my door. A simple experiment, a offering maybe, or bait. I marked the water level with a permanent marker and took a photo with my phone for evidence. When I woke at 10 p.m., the glass was inside my apartment, sitting on my coffee table. The water level had risen, not fallen, and floating in it was a key I didn't recognize. An old skeleton key, the kind that might open any door in a building this age. The metal was cold enough to burn my fingers when I fished it out. I knew what I had to do. At 3 a.m., when the sounds above reached their nightly crescendo, I took the key and climbed the stairs. My bare feet made no sound on the worn carpet. The hallway stretched before me, seeming to pulse with each flicker of the dying fluorescent bulbs. The doormat of 2B was soaked through, water pooling around it in a perfect rectangle that defied gravity, refusing to spread across the hallway floor. The key slid into the lock with no resistance, as if the lock had been waiting for it. Had always been waiting. I turned it slowly, hearing the tumblers fall into place with wet clicks. The door swung inward on silent hinges, revealing darkness so complete it seemed solid. I stepped inside. The apartment was wrong. Not just empty, wrong. The layout mirrored mine but stretched in impossible directions. The walls breathed with moisture, expanding and contracting like lungs. Water ran down every surface without source or destination. And the furniture, my furniture, I realized with growing horror, was arranged exactly as it was in my apartment below, but aged decades in moments, waterlogged and swollen. In the center of what should have been the living room, a figure stood with its back to me. Tall, too tall for the ceiling, yet somehow fitting. Water streamed from its body, not like someone who had been swimming, but like someone who was made of water, barely holding human form. It turned, no, flowed, to face me, and I saw my own face looking back, distorted as if viewed through that green glass, features running like watercolors in rain. It smiled with too many teeth and spoke without moving its mouth. The words came from the water itself, from the walls, from inside my own skull. You've been living in 2B all along. 1B has been vacant for months. Didn't they tell you about the water damage? Didn't they mention the previous tenant who wouldn't leave? Who couldn't leave? Who forgot he was drowning? I ran. Or tried to. The floor had become soft, yielding, pulling at my feet with each step. I burst through the door, stumbled down stairs that seemed to multiply beneath me, and crashed into what I thought was my apartment. But the furniture was wrong. Ancient. Waterlogged. A green glass sat on the table, full of clear water that reflected a face I didn't recognize as my own. I don't know which apartment I'm in anymore. The landlord doesn't return my calls, or maybe I'm not calling the right number. Maybe I'm not calling at all. The water damage in my ceiling has spread, creating patterns that look like a map of a place I've never been, but remember drowning in. Sometimes I find myself standing in the hallway at 3 a.m., soaking wet, holding objects I don't remember picking up. Sometimes I'm the one moving furniture, trying to remember the right arrangement, the one that will make everything normal again. There's a glass of water on my table now. I don't remember placing it there, but I must have. The fingerprints around it are mine, aren't they? They have to be mine. Even if the fingers seem too long, too thin, even if they leave marks that won't dry, that spread across every surface I touch like the water damage spreading through the walls. The neighbors complain about noise from my apartment at night. They say it's been vacant for months, that nobody's lived there since the incident. But I'm here. I'm writing this. I exist. Don't I? The water is rising now, seeping through the floorboards, running down the walls in rivulets that spell out words I can't read. The furniture is moving again, but I can see it now. It's floating, drifting in currents that shouldn't exist in a room full of air. Unless the air isn't air anymore. Unless I've been breathing water all along, mistaking drowning for living, mistaking 2B for 1B, mistaking myself for someone who survived whatever happened in that apartment above. Or below. I've lost track. There's someone knocking at my door now. Steady, patient knocks that match my heartbeat. When I look through the peephole, I see myself standing in the hallway, completely dry, holding a glass of water and smiling. I'm still smiling as I reach for the doorknob, as my hand passes through it like it's made of water, as I realize I've been the one knocking all along. The glass on my table is empty now, or full, or gone, or it was never there, like the apartment was never there, like I was never there. Just water damage, and the sound of someone who forgot they were drowning, moving furniture in the night, trying to remember what solid ground felt like. Tomorrow I'll leave another object on the doormat of 2B, or find one, or become one. The distinction doesn't seem to matter anymore. Nothing does except the sound of water running behind the walls, inside the walls, through the walls, carrying away pieces of whoever I used to be, whoever lives in 1B, whoever haunts 2B, whoever we are together in this space between drowning and breathing. The building settles around me, or I settle into it. In the morning, someone will complain about water damage. Someone always does. But morning feels very far away, and the water is so cold, and the furniture needs rearranging, and there's someone living in the apartment below me who looks exactly like I used to look before the water came. Before I came. Before we became the same thing, flowing between floors like a memory of drowning, leaving wet footprints that will never dry, moving furniture in the night because that's what the living do, isn't it? Isn't it? Story 14. And the footprints appeared on my third night in the cabin. I'd come to this forgotten corner of New England seeking silence, the kind that lets words flow unimpeded from mind to page. The rental listing had undersold the isolation, 40 minutes from the nearest town, accessible only by a dirt road that seemed to narrow with each passing mile, as if the forest were slowly reclaiming it. Perfect, I'd thought. No distractions, no excuses. Just me, my manuscript, and the oppressive deadline that had driven me here. The cabin squatted at the edge of a small lake, its weathered boards the color of old bones. Inside it was sparse but functional, a stone fireplace, a kitchen with appliances from the 70s, a desk positioned beneath a window overlooking the water. The only peculiar feature was an antique mirror mounted on the living room wall, its silvered surface spiderwebbed with cracks that distorted my reflection into fragments. Those first 2 nights passed quietly enough. I wrote during the day, the steady clatter of my laptop keys competing with the lap of water against the shore. Evenings I'd sit on the porch with a glass of whiskey, watching mist rise from the lake like the breath of something sleeping beneath. The isolation felt productive, necessary even. Then came the 3rd morning. I woke to find them, wet impressions crossing the living room floor, each one perfectly formed, as if someone had walked barefoot from the lake straight through my door. The prints were small, almost delicate, with high arches and splayed toes. They tracked from the entrance to the center of the room, where they stopped directly in front of the cracked mirror. My first thought was logical. I must have gone outside during the night, perhaps to relieve myself, and forgotten. But my feet were dry, my shoes exactly where I'd left them by the door. The prints were already beginning to evaporate in the morning sun streaming through the windows, leaving only the faintest outline on the worn wooden boards. I spent that day trying to focus on my work, but my attention kept drifting to the floor, to the memory of those prints. By evening, I'd convinced myself it was nothing, a trick of condensation perhaps, or moisture seeping up through the old boards. The whiskey tasted sharper that night, and I drank more than usual before retreating to bed. The 4th morning brought them again, clearer this time, more defined. The same path from door to mirror, but now I could see details. The gentle curve of each heel, the press of individual toes. The water that formed them was murky, carrying the faint smell of lake bottom, that mixture of decomposition and earth that speaks of things long submerged. That's when I noticed my lighter was missing. It was a silver Zippo, a gift from someone I'd rather forget, but I'd grown attached to its weight in my pocket. I searched the cabin methodically, checking every surface, every drawer. Nothing. The absence nagged at me as I tried to write, my fingers fumbling over keys, producing gibberish instead of prose. Late afternoon, I walked down to the lake to clear my head. The water was still as glass, reflecting the overcast sky in perfect detail. That's when I saw it. My lighter, hanging from a low branch that stretched over the water, suspended by fishing line so thin it was nearly invisible. It turned slowly in the breeze, catching what little light filtered through the clouds. I waded in to retrieve it, the cold water shocking against my shins. As I reached for the lighter, I noticed something else hanging from the same branch. My notebook, the one I'd been using for handwritten notes. Its pages were swollen with moisture, the ink running in dark rivulets that looked disturbingly organic, like veins beneath skin. The water around my legs seemed to thicken, resisting my movement as I grabbed both items and stumbled back to shore. My notebook was ruined, the words I'd written transformed into an illegible smear. But on the last page, which had been blank, new words appeared as the paper dried. Come back. I told myself someone was playing a prank. Perhaps the cabin's owner, or local kids who knew about the rental. But the nearest neighbor was miles away, and I'd seen no one since arriving. Still, the alternative, that something else was responsible, seemed impossible to contemplate in the fading daylight. That night, I barricaded the door with a chair and stayed awake, listening. The cabin creaked and settled, each sound making me tense. Around 3 in the morning, I heard it. The soft splash of footsteps in shallow water, growing closer. Then silence. Then the unmistakable sound of the door handle turning. The chair held. Morning revealed the footprints again, but this time they didn't stop at the mirror. They circled it, as if something had paced there, examining its own reflection, or mine. The mirror's cracks seemed deeper, more pronounced, and in certain angles of light, I could swear I saw movement within them, like water flowing through the fractured glass. My wallet was missing now. I found it that afternoon naturally, hanging from the same branch over the lake. But when I opened it, the photograph I kept tucked behind my driver's license, the one I never looked at but couldn't bring myself to throw away, was gone. In its place was a piece of wet kelp, still dripping, that smelled of deep water and old secrets. The rational part of my mind was fighting a losing battle. I tried to leave that day, but my car wouldn't start. The engine turned over but wouldn't catch, as if the fuel line had been cut. My phone, which had barely worked since I'd arrived, now showed no signal at all. The isolation that had seemed so perfect now felt deliberately crafted, as if the forest and lake had conspired to keep me here. That evening, against every instinct, I found myself following the wet footprints when they appeared again. They led me outside this time, across the porch and down to the water's edge. The mist was thick, almost solid, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. The footprints continued onto the surface of the lake, each one creating a small depression in the water that held its shape for impossible seconds before smoothing over. I stood at the edge, my bare feet sinking slightly into the muddy shore. The water lapped at my toes with unusual warmth, and I could feel something beneath. Not the lake bottom, but a presence, vast and patient. The mist parted slightly and I saw them, dozens of objects hanging from the trees that ringed the lake. Glasses, keys, photographs, jewelry, all suspended at exactly the same height, turning slowly in no wind I could feel. Some looked recent. Others were so weathered they might have hung there for decades. The footprints on the water pulsed with a faint luminescence leading deeper into the mist. I took a step forward, the water accepting my weight as if it were solid. Another step. The warmth traveled up my legs, not unpleasant, almost welcoming. Behind me, I heard the cabin door open, though I'd locked it. Footsteps crossed the floor. My floor, with my rhythm, though I stood here at the water's edge. I understood then, with the clarity that comes from accepting the impossible, that the lake remembered everyone who'd ever stood where I stood now, every lonely soul who'd sought isolation and found something else entirely. The mirror in the cabin didn't reflect. It recorded, and the cracks were not damage but doorways, each one leading back to the water. The mist cleared enough for me to see the center of the lake, where the footprints converged. There was something there, just beneath the surface, not quite an island, not quite submerged. It looked like a congregation of shapes, human-sized but wrong in their stillness. They stood in the water up to their shoulders, facing outward, their heads tilted back as if watching the sky through the lens of the lake's surface. One of them had my face. Not exactly my face. Older, perhaps, or younger. It was hard to tell through the distortion of the water, but the resemblance was undeniable. It stood among the others, patient, eternal, waiting for something I couldn't name. As I watched, its eyes opened beneath the water, meeting mine across the impossible distance. The warmth from the lake had reached my chest now, seeping through my clothes, my skin, settling into my bones. I could taste it in the back of my throat. Minerals and memories, the flavor of every secret the lake had swallowed. My notebook, the one I'd retrieved, was in my hand, though I didn't remember picking it up. It fell open to a page that should have been ruined but now showed clear text in my own handwriting. The water remembers everything. Every visitor, every watcher, every version of every choice. You've been here before. You'll be here again. The cabin is a door, the mirror is a map, and the lake. The lake is where all the copies wait. I wanted to step back, to return to the cabin, to flee entirely. But my reflection in the lake, the one standing in the water, raised its hand, and I felt my own arm move in response. We were synchronized, or perhaps we always had been, separated only by the thin membrane of the surface. The hanging objects in the trees began to chime against each other, a sound like broken bells. More footprints appeared on the water's surface, converging from all directions. The mist thickened again, and in it, I could see the shadows of others standing at the shore, in different times, different years, all faced with the same choice. Some stepped forward, some stepped back, but all of them remained, in one way or another. I still stand here, at the edge, though I'm no longer certain how long it's been. Minutes? Days? The footprints that cross my cabin floor each morning might be mine, from when I finally choose. Or they might be mine from when I already have. in some other version of this moment that the lake remembers and replays. The manuscript I came here to write sits unfinished on the desk. Or perhaps it's complete, and I simply can't remember writing the ending. Sometimes I'm in the cabin, typing these words. Sometimes I'm in the lake, watching someone who looks like me typing these words. The distinction matters less with each passing moment. The mirror shows me fractured into a dozen possibilities, each crack a different choice, a different timeline where I stepped forward or stayed behind. In some, the cabin is empty, waiting for the next writer, the next seeker of isolation. In others, it's full of versions of myself, all writing the same story with different endings. The water is patient. It has waited this long. It can wait longer. The objects hanging from the trees turn in their eternal orbit, each one a marker of someone's moment of understanding. My lighter is there, and my notebook, and the photograph I thought I'd lost. Though when I look closer, the face in it isn't quite the one I remember. Tomorrow the footprints will appear again. They always do. They'll cross the floor and stop at the mirror, or continue to the lake, or perhaps diverge into new patterns I haven't seen yet. I'll follow them or I won't. I'll understand what they mean, or I'll remain in this space between knowing and unknowing, between the cabin and the water, between myself and all the other selves the lake remembers. The mist is rising again. Through it I can see lights, not from houses or cars, but from other cabins, in other times, all of them the same cabin, all of them different. Their windows glow with the light of laptops and candles and fires that might be warming or might be consuming. In each one, someone writes or prepares to write or has given up writing altogether. The water remembers everything. Every story started but never finished. Every isolation that became something else. Every footprint that led from shore to surface to depth. I understand now why the rental was so cheap, why the road seems to narrow each time someone drives it, why the isolation is so perfect and so perfectly wrong. The cabin isn't a retreat. It's a collection point. A place where the lake gathers its watchers, its waiters, its recorded memories of everyone who sought solitude and found multiplicity instead. The footprints on the water pulse brighter. My reflection raises both hands now, beckoning. Or perhaps I'm the reflection, and it's the original standing on the shore. The distinction dissolves like morning mist, like wet footprints on old wooden floors, like the barrier between what's real and what the water remembers. I step forward, or I step back, or I remain exactly where I am, where I've always been, where I'll always be. The lake remembers everything, even this. Found among the effects at the abandoned Blackwater cabin, October 2024. The manuscript appears to have been written by multiple hands, though forensic analysis confirms they all belong to the same person. The cabin's rental history shows no bookings for the past 18 months. Local authorities report several missing persons in the area. All writers or artists seeking isolation. The lake remains under investigation. Story 15. I've been living in this apartment for 6 weeks now, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that every single night, at exactly 3 a.m., the door to my living room opens by itself. The first time it happened, I'd convinced myself it was the wind. Old building, drafty windows, uneven floors, all perfectly reasonable explanations for a door swinging open in the dead of night. I'd stumbled out of bed, half asleep, closed it, and thought nothing more of it. But when it happened again the next night, and the next, and the next, I started paying attention. By the end of the first week, I'd checked everything. The hinges weren't loose. The door frame was level. The latch clicked firmly into place every time I shut it. I even tested the windows, sealed them with tape to eliminate any possibility of a draft. Still, at 3 a.m. sharp, I'd hear that soft, deliberate creak as the door swung inward. The sound itself had become a nightly torment. It wasn't the violent bang of a door thrown open by wind, nor the gradual drift of poor balance. It was measured, controlled, as if someone were pushing it open slowly, carefully, trying not to make too much noise. The hinges would protest with a long, drawn-out groan that seemed to last forever in the silence of the night. Then nothing. Just the door standing open, revealing the darkness of my living room beyond. I started sleeping with my bedroom door locked, though I knew how ridiculous that was. Whatever was opening the living room door wasn't trying to get to me, at least not yet. It was just opening it every night. Same time, same slow, deliberate motion. During the second week, I set up a camera. Nothing fancy, just my old phone propped up on a stack of books, aimed at the door. I reviewed the footage the next morning with trembling fingers, fast-forwarding to 2:59 a.m. The timestamp ticked over to 3000, and the door began to move. No shadow in the frame, no hand on the knob, no visible force acting upon it. It simply opened, smooth and steady, until it stood at roughly a 45-degree angle. Then it stopped. I must have watched that video 50 times, looking for something, anything that could explain it. A trick of the light, a digital artifact, evidence of tampering. But there was nothing. Just a door opening by itself in an empty room. By the third week, I'd stopped trying to rationalize it. I'd moved past the stage of checking for magnetic fields, investigating the building's history, or searching for hidden mechanisms. The superintendent thought I was losing it when I asked about previous tenants. He just shrugged and said the last guy had moved out suddenly after 2 months. Didn't say why. The woman before him lasted 3. I started noticing other things too. Little things that might have always been there but seemed magnified now that I was looking for them. The way shadows seemed to pool in the corners of the living room, darker and deeper than they should be. The faint smell that would drift through the apartment after 3 a.m., something organic and old, like wet earth or rotting wood, though I could never locate its source. The way the air felt heavier after the door opened, pressing against my skin like humid breath. Sleep became elusive. I'd lie awake watching my alarm clock, counting down the minutes. 2:45, 2:50, 2:55. My heart would start racing around 2:58, and by 2:59, I'd be sitting up in bed, every muscle tensed, waiting. The anticipation was almost worse than the event itself. Sometimes I'd creep to my bedroom door and press my ear against it, listening. Other times I'd bury my head under my pillow, trying to block out the sound I knew was coming. But I always heard it, that slow, inevitable creak. One night during the 4th week, I decided to confront it. I sat in the living room with all the lights on, facing the door. I'd had 3 cups of coffee and my hands were shaking. From caffeine or fear, I couldn't tell. As 3 a.m. approached, the room seemed to grow colder. The lights flickered once, twice, then steadied. My phone, sitting on the coffee table, went dark despite being fully charged. 2:59, 45, 50, 55. The door handle began to turn. I'd never seen that before. In all my observations, the door had simply swung open. But now, sitting here in direct view, I watched as the brass handle rotated slowly downward. The latch disengaged with a soft click that seemed to echo in my chest. Then the door began its familiar journey inward. I wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at me to get out, to leave this place and never come back. But I forced myself to stay seated, to watch. The door opened to its usual angle and stopped. The room beyond was pitch black despite the spillover from my living room lights. It was as if the darkness were a solid thing, a wall that light couldn't penetrate. Then I saw them, eyes, or what might have been eyes. 2 points of reflected light, roughly at human height, somewhere in that impossible darkness. They didn't move, didn't blink, just watched. I stared back, unable to look away, my breath coming in short, painful gasps. We remained like that for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Then the door closed. Not slowly this time, but firmly, decisively. The latch clicked back into place, and the presence, whatever it was gone. I sat there until dawn, unable to move, unable to process what I'd seen. When the sun finally came up and filled the room with normal, blessed daylight, I walked over and opened the door myself. The living room was just my living room. Nothing out of place, nothing unusual, just furniture and morning shadows. The 5th week brought escalation. The door still opened at 3 a.m., but now it wouldn't stay closed during the day. I'd shut it, hear the latch engage, walk away, and find it open again minutes later. Not wide open, just cracked, as if something were peeking through. I started propping a chair against it, but I'd find the chair moved aside, placed neatly back in its original position by the dining table. My work began to suffer. I was calling in sick more often, too exhausted and anxious to focus on anything beyond the door. Friends stopped texting after I'd ignored them for weeks. My sister left voicemails asking if I was okay, saying I sounded different, stressed. I couldn't explain to her that I was being haunted by a door, that something was visiting my apartment every night at 3 a.m. How could anyone understand that? I researched the building's history more thoroughly. Built in 1947, nothing unusual in the records. No murders, no suicides, no tragic accidents. Just a normal apartment building with normal tenants living normal lives. Except they all left. I found a pattern going back years. No one stayed in this unit for more than 6 months. Most left after 2 or 3. The thought of moving crossed my mind daily, but something held me back. Part of it was practical. I'd signed a lease, put down deposits, couldn't afford to break it. But another part, a part I didn't want to acknowledge, was curiosity, or maybe obsession. I needed to know what was behind that door at 3 a.m., what wanted in or out so badly that it returned every single night without fail. Last night, the start of my 6th week, I tried something different. I removed the door entirely. It took me 2 hours with a screwdriver and considerable effort, but I managed to lift it off its hinges and lean it against the hallway wall. I stood in the empty door frame, looking into my living room, feeling simultaneously accomplished and foolish. What was I trying to prove? That without a door, nothing could open? I went to bed at midnight, exhausted from the effort and the anxiety. For the first time in weeks, I fell asleep quickly, deeply. No countdown to 3 a.m., no tensed muscles, no racing heart. I woke to the sound of creaking. My bedroom clock read 3 a.m. The sound was coming from the living room, that same familiar groan of hinges under pressure. But there was no door. There were no hinges. There was nothing to creak. I forced myself out of bed and crept to my bedroom door, pressing my ear against it. The creaking continued, rhythmic and deliberate. Then it stopped, just as it always did when the door would have been fully open. The silence that followed was complete, oppressive. No traffic sounds from outside, no hum of electricity, no neighbor's footsteps above. Nothing. Then I heard breathing. Not mine. I was holding my breath. This was different, deeper, wet, like lungs that weren't quite human trying to process air they weren't designed for. It was in the hallway, right outside my bedroom door. I could feel the presence through the wood, massive and wrong, waiting. The doorknob to my bedroom began to turn. I'd locked it, but I watched as the lock disengaged by itself, the little button in the center of the knob popping out with a soft click. The knob continued its rotation, and the door began to open. Not quickly, not violently, slowly, deliberately. Exactly the same way the living room door had opened every night for 6 weeks. I backed away, stumbling over my own feet, pressing myself against the far wall. The door swung inward, revealing not my hallway, but that same impenetrable darkness I'd seen in the living room. Those same 2 points of light, closer now, at the threshold of my sanctuary. A voice spoke, not with words, but directly into my mind, bypassing my ears entirely. It was old, older than the building, older than the city. It said I'd been expected, that every tenant was tested, and all had failed by fleeing. But I had stayed. I had watched. I had removed the barrier myself, thinking I was clever. The darkness began to spill into my room like fog, crawling across the floor, up the walls. Where it touched, reality seemed to bend. My furniture aged decades in seconds, paint peeling, wood rotting. My modern apartment was becoming something else. Somewhere else. The presence at the door moved forward, and I saw, I can't describe what I saw. My mind won't let me. It's protection, I think, from something that human consciousness wasn't meant to process. But I remember the feeling of being utterly, completely known. Every thought, every fear, every secret laid bare before something that had been waiting far longer than 6 weeks. That had been waiting since before the building was built, before the land was claimed, before humans walked upright. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The darkness receded like a tide pulling back. The presence withdrew. My room returned to normal, furniture intact, paint fresh, reality stable. The only evidence anything had happened was my bedroom door, standing open, and the living room door, somehow back on its hinges, firmly closed. I looked at my clock. 3:01 a.m. I haven't slept since. It's been 18 hours and I'm sitting here typing this, trying to make sense of what happened, trying to decide what to do. The sun is setting now, and in a few hours it will be 3 a.m. again. The door will open. But I don't think it's trying to let something in anymore. I think it's trying to let something out. Something that's been here all along, in this room with me, watching me sleep, waiting for me to understand. Every night at 3 a.m., the door opens to give it a chance to leave, to return to wherever it came from. But it can't. Not anymore. Because I've seen it. I've acknowledged it. And now it's bound to me. Or I'm bound to it. The door opens at 3 a.m. to offer escape. Not for what's outside, but for me. A chance to flee like all the others did. A 45-degree angle, just wide enough for a person to slip through. The previous tenants understood this eventually. They took the invitation and ran. But I removed the door. I refused the offer. And now I'm beginning to understand that some invitations, once declined, can never be extended again. It's 2:47 a.m. now. 13 minutes until the door opens. I can feel it building, that familiar pressure in the air. My coffee's cold, my hands are steady for the first time in weeks, and I'm not afraid anymore. How can you fear something that's already inside? 2:50 a.m. 10 minutes. I've decided to wait in the living room tonight, not to confront anything, not to investigate, just to sit and wait and see what happens when the door opens and I don't run, when I don't even flinch, when I simply accept whatever has been trying to make itself known. 2:55 a.m. The walls are beginning to breathe. 2:58 a.m. The lights are dimming even though I haven't touched the switch. 2:59 a.m. I can hear it now. Not just the door, but everything. The building's heartbeat. The whispers in the walls. The thing that's been living in my shadow since the day I moved in. Patient and eternal. 2:59:30. It's almost time. 2:59:45. The handle is beginning to turn. 2:59:55. I'm ready. 3 a.m. The door is open. But this time I understand. It was never about what was trying to get in. It was about what I was becoming. And now, as I sit here in the darkness that pours through that open door, I finally understand why the previous tenants fled. Not from fear of what they saw, but from fear of what they were starting to want, what they were starting to need. The door opens at 3 a.m. It will open tomorrow night, and the night after, and every night until the next tenant arrives. They'll think it's the wind at first. They'll check the hinges, seal the windows, set up cameras. They'll sit where I'm sitting now, thinking they're brave, thinking they're different. But they'll learn, just as I have, that some doors aren't meant to keep things out or let things in. Some doors are meant to show us what we really are when all the lights go out. Story 16. The TV was on again. I stood in my doorway, keys still jangling in my hand, staring at the familiar blue glow washing over my living room walls. The local news anchor's voice drifted through the space, discussing tomorrow's weather with that practiced cheerfulness that felt obscene in the context of my growing dread. My fingers found the light switch, and harsh overhead fluorescence chased away the television's softer illumination, but it didn't chase away the cold settling into my bones. 3 weeks. That's how long this had been happening. At first, I'd blamed myself. Muscle memory, distraction, the autopilot of routine. We all do things without thinking. Lock doors, turn off stoves, set alarms. Why not turn on televisions? I work from home after all. The TV had become background noise during the pandemic, a companion voice to fill the silence. It made sense that I might flip it on without consciously registering the action. But then came the night I woke at 3:17 a.m. to find my bedroom awash in that same pale light, the TV murmuring at low volume about a car accident on Route 9. I remembered the exact time because I'd stared at my phone's clock for a full minute, trying to convince myself I was still dreaming. The remote sat on my nightstand, exactly where I'd left it, cold to the touch, as if it hadn't been handled in hours. I shuffled to the kitchen now, setting my laptop bag on the counter with exaggerated normalcy. The news continued its drone from the living room. Something about a school board meeting, budget concerns, the mundane horror of everyday life that felt like mockery compared to what was happening in my apartment. My hands shook slightly as I poured myself a glass of water. The ice cubes clinked too loudly, each sound sharp as breaking glass in the quiet. I needed to think rationally about this. There had to be an explanation. Timer malfunction. That was the first theory I'd pursued. Modern TVs had all sorts of scheduling features I'd never bothered to learn. I'd spent an entire evening scrolling through menu after menu, checking every possible automated setting. All disabled. I'd even called the manufacturer's helpline, enduring 40 minutes of hold music to confirm there were no known issues with my model spontaneously activating. Electrical problems came next. I'd had the building's maintenance supervisor check my apartment's wiring, claiming I'd been experiencing weird power fluctuations. He'd found nothing unusual, though he'd given me a long look when I'd insisted he check twice. The way his eyes had lingered on the TV made me wonder if he knew something, but when I'd pressed, he'd only shrugged and muttered something about old buildings having their quirks. I walked back to the living room, water glass sweating in my grip. The TV displayed a commercial now, a woman laughing over salad, the kind of advertisement that felt like it existed in another universe from mine. I grabbed the remote and clicked it off. The sudden silence felt heavier than the noise had been. My phone buzzed. A text from my sister. "Haven't heard from you lately. Everything okay?" I started to type a response, then deleted it. Started again. Deleted. What would I say? That I was being haunted by basic cable? That my television had developed consciousness and chose to express it through daytime programming? I set the phone aside without answering. The apartment felt different these days. It's hard to explain precisely how. The furniture remained in the same positions, the walls the same off-white they'd been when I'd moved in 2 years ago. But there was a weight to the air now, a thickness that made breathing feel like work. The corners seemed darker, even with all the lights on, and there was a sensation, persistent and maddening, of being observed. I'd started sleeping poorly, not just because of the TV, though being jolted awake by sudden commercials at ungodly hours didn't help. It was the feeling that preceded the sound, a prickling awareness that would pull me from sleep moments before the set would flicker to life, as if something was watching me, waiting for that exact moment when I hovered between consciousness and dreams. Last Tuesday, I'd tried sleeping at a hotel. I'd told myself it was a test, a way to determine if the problem was the apartment or me. I'd barely closed my eyes when the hotel's television had burst into life, volume at maximum, the sound of canned laughter filling the room like screaming. The front desk had been apologetic when I'd complained, offering to move me to another room. I'd declined and driven home at 2 a.m., knowing with cold certainty that the problem would follow me anywhere. The water glass slipped from my numb fingers. It shattered against the hardwood floor in a constellation of fragments, water spreading in a dark pool that reflected the ceiling light. I stared at it, transfixed by the way the liquid crept along the grain of the wood, following paths predetermined by tiny imperfections in the floor's surface, like it knew where to go, like everything was following some invisible script I couldn't read. I grabbed paper towels, knelt carefully among the glass shards. As I mopped up the water, I became aware of a sound, barely perceptible, like breathing through fabric. I froze, paper towel dripping in my hand. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, a rhythmic whisper that made my skin crawl. The TV turned on. I wasn't in the living room. I couldn't see it from my position on the kitchen floor, but I heard the distinctive electronic pop of the screen coming to life, followed by the murmur of voices. A game show, by the sound of it. Applause rattled through the apartment like distant thunder. I stood slowly, legs trembling. Through the doorway, I could see the remote on the coffee table exactly where I'd left it. The TV screen showed a wheel of fortune spinning, contestants clapping with mechanical enthusiasm. Nobody had touched the remote. Nobody could have touched it. I lived alone. I'd always lived alone. Hadn't I? The thought came unbidden, ice cold and wrong. Of course I lived alone. I'd signed the lease myself, moved in my own boxes, arranged my sparse furniture according to my own preferences. But suddenly, horribly, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't entirely true, that maybe I'd forgotten something. Someone. I forced myself to walk to the living room, glass crunching under my shoes. The game show continued its bright parade of prizes and possibility. I picked up the remote, feeling its familiar weight, the slight stickiness of the volume buttons from a spilled beer months ago. Real, tangible, normal. But when I pressed the power button, nothing happened. I pressed it again. The red light on the TV blinked, acknowledging the signal, but the screen remained lit. The host was explaining the rules of the bonus round, his voice taking on a strange quality, as if he was speaking directly to me through layers of static and time. The batteries. It had to be the batteries. I flipped open the remote's back panel, and the batteries tumbled out onto the coffee table. They rolled in opposite directions, one falling to the floor with a dull thud. But the TV remained on. The contestants spun the wheel again, and I could swear their faces turned toward me, though the angle of the camera hadn't changed. I unplugged the TV. The screen went dark for exactly 3 seconds. Then it blazed back to life, brighter than before. The game show replaced by static that formed patterns, almost faces, almost words, before dissolving back into chaos. The sound was different too, no longer the white noise hiss of dead air, but something organic, like breathing or whispering, or the rustle of something large moving in a confined space. My laptop. I needed my laptop. I could document this, record it, prove to myself that this was happening. I stumbled to the kitchen, grabbing my computer from my bag. When I returned, the TV showed the news again. The same anchor from earlier, except now she stared directly at the camera, unblinking, her mouth moving in words that didn't match the sound emerging from the speakers. I opened my laptop, started recording with the webcam. Through the screen, everything looked normal. The TV played its program. The anchor discussed local events. Nothing suggested the wrongness I felt in my bones. I stopped recording, looked at the TV directly. The anchor's eyes followed my movement, tracking me as I stepped to the left, then right. I looked at the laptop screen again. On camera, her eyes remained fixed straight ahead. A neighbor. I needed to get a neighbor, someone else to witness this. But when I reached my apartment door, my hand stopped on the knob. What would I say? How would I explain? And worse, what if they saw nothing unusual? What if the TV only performed for me? Or what if they saw it too, and it meant I wasn't crazy, which was somehow more terrifying than losing my mind? I returned to the living room, sank onto the couch. The TV had switched to a nature documentary. Lions stalked through tall grass, patient and predatory. The narrator's voice was soothing, almost hypnotic, describing the hunt in intimate detail. I found myself leaning forward, drawn into the screen despite myself. That's when I noticed the reflection. In the dark glass of the TV screen, superimposed over the savannah scene, I could see my living room. I could see myself on the couch, hunched and staring. But there was something else. A shape behind me, tall and indistinct, like smoke given form. I whirled around, heart hammering. Nothing. Empty air and familiar walls. I turned back to the TV. The reflection remained, and now the shape was clearer. almost human in outline but wrong in proportion, too tall, joints at impossible angles. It stood directly behind my reflected self, and as I watched, frozen in horror, it leaned down. Its head, if it had a head, hovered next to mine in the reflection. The documentary continued. The lions closed in on their prey. The narrator explained how the gazelle, in its final moments, experienced a strange calm, a biological mercy that made the inevitable easier to accept. On the screen, in the reflection, the shape whispered something to my reflected self, who nodded slowly, mechanically. I wasn't nodding. I was sure I wasn't nodding, but my neck felt strange, stiff, as if it had moved without my permission. The TV turned off. The sudden darkness felt like falling. I sat in the silent apartment, breathing hard, waiting for my eyes to adjust. Outside, I could hear normal evening sounds. Cars passing, a dog barking, someone's music playing too loud. The real world continuing its rotation, oblivious to whatever was happening in my living room. I stood on shaking legs, not trusting myself to turn on any lights. I needed to leave. Pack a bag, get in my car, drive until I ran out of gas or nerve. But as I moved toward the bedroom, I heard it. The distinctive sound of the TV turning on behind me. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Because I knew with absolute certainty that if I did, I would see myself still sitting on the couch, staring at the screen with vacant eyes. I would see myself nod at whatever the shape whispered. I would understand that I'd been watching myself watching the TV for who knows how long, trapped in a loop of observation that started when had it started? I couldn't remember coming home today. I remembered standing in the doorway with my keys, but not the drive home, not leaving the office. Did I still have an office? Did I still have a job? The questions felt distant, unimportant compared to the sound of the TV behind me, playing what sounded like my own voice reading the evening news. My phone rang. Unknown number. I answered without thinking, desperate for any connection to the outside world. Static. Then, clear as day, my own voice. Stop fighting it. We've been waiting so patiently. I dropped the phone. It continued speaking from the floor, my voice growing distorted, multiplying into a chorus of myself. The TV volume increased, matching the phone, surrounding me with my own words twisted into something unrecognizable. I ran to the bathroom, slammed the door, turned on all the lights. In the mirror, my reflection looked wrong, tired, yes, terrified certainly, but also somehow not quite synchronized with my movements. A half-second delay, like a bad video connection. I raised my hand. My reflection raised its hand a moment later. I touched the glass. My reflection touched back, but its fingers pressed harder as if trying to push through. The bathroom TV turned on. I didn't have a bathroom TV. I'd never had a bathroom TV. But there it was, mounted on the wall where a medicine cabinet should be, playing static that formed patterns. In those patterns, I saw myself from a dozen angles, 100 angles, all watching TVs that showed other versions of myself watching TVs. An infinite regression of observers and observed, each thinking they were the real one, each slowly realizing they were just another channel in someone else's viewing experience. The knock at the bathroom door was soft, almost polite. I didn't answer, couldn't answer. My throat had closed, every muscle locked in terror. Another knock, then my voice from the other side. I'm home. But I was home. I was here. Who was I? The question hit like ice water. I knew my name, my age, my job, but suddenly these felt like facts I'd memorized rather than lived, like credits at the end of a show I'd been watching. The person in the mirror stared back, and I couldn't be sure if I was looking at my reflection or if my reflection was looking at me. The door opened. I stood there. Another me. Identical down to the coffee stain on my shirt I'd gotten that morning. Was it this morning? I smiled, an expression I'd never seen on my own face. Too wide, too knowing. Time to switch, the other me said. And I understood. The TV hadn't been turning on by itself. It had been turned on by whoever was here before me, whoever's turn it was to watch. To be real. To think they were real while the others waited in reflections and static, growing more solid as the current occupant grew more transparent. I looked at my hands. I could see through them now, just slightly, like looking through frosted glass. How long? I asked, though I wasn't sure which of us was speaking. Does it matter? Your turn is ending. My turn is beginning. And somewhere else, another us is asking the same question. The TV in the bathroom grew louder, static resolving into a clear picture. I saw myself sitting on a couch in an apartment I didn't recognize, watching a TV that showed me standing in this bathroom. That version of me looked directly at the camera, at me, and nodded slowly. I was nodding too. Or maybe I was always nodding. Maybe that's all any of us did. Nod along to a script we couldn't see, playing our parts in a show with no audience except ourselves. The other me stepped aside, gesturing to the door. Beyond it, I could hear multiple TVs now, all playing different channels, all showing different versions of the same scene from slightly different angles. I walked toward the sound, my feet feeling less solid with each step. In the living room, they were all there. Dozens of me, some solid, some translucent, some just shadows cast by the TV's light. All watching, all waiting for their turn to be real, to forget they were just another channel someone else might flip past. I sat on the couch. The remote was in my hand, though I didn't remember picking it up. On the screen, I saw another apartment, another me just coming home, staring at a TV that was mysteriously on. He looked confused, frightened. He was about to begin his 3 weeks of slowly understanding. I wanted to warn him, wanted to scream at him to run, to never look at the screen, to break every TV he could find. But my mouth wouldn't move except to speak the words the show required. The weather tomorrow will be partly cloudy with a chance of afternoon showers. Somewhere, a me that was no longer quite me anymore faded into static. Somewhere else, a me that wasn't yet me started to solidify. The cycle continued, had always continued, would always continue. The TV was on again. It was always on. I was always home, had always been home, would always be coming home to find it waiting for me with its patient electric glow and its promise that this time, I was the real one, the one watching instead of being watched. But we were all being watched, by ourselves, by each other, by something that fed on observation itself, that grew stronger every time we questioned which side of the screen we were really on. My phone buzzed. A text from my sister. Haven't heard from you lately. Everything okay? I typed with fingers I could no longer quite feel. Everything's fine. Just watching TV. Send. On the screen, the other me was about to check the timer settings. He would find nothing wrong, because nothing was wrong with the TV. The TV was working perfectly, doing exactly what it was designed to do, keeping us watching, keeping us guessing, keeping us here in this loop where every version thinks it's the real one, right up until the moment it realizes it's just another program. The remote was cold in my hand. I could change the channel, see what the other versions were doing, but I knew they were all the same show with slight variations, the same apartment, the same confusion, the same slow dissolution into static and resignation. Outside the world continued, or maybe it didn't. Maybe it was just another channel, another show, another layer of observation folding in on itself infinitely. Maybe everyone was sitting in their own apartments, watching their own mysteriously activated TVs, slowly realizing they were part of something vast and patient and hungry for attention. The news anchor on the screen looked directly at me. Her lips moved, but I heard my own voice emerge. Stay tuned. We'll be right back after these messages. The commercial that followed showed a man coming home to find his TV on. He looked confused, concerned. The tagline appeared. When you're ready to see what's really on, you're already watching. I laughed, or someone laughed with my mouth. The sound echoed from every TV in the apartment. A chorus of my own voice finding humor in something I didn't understand. My reflection in the dark TV screen wasn't laughing. It was screaming, silently, endlessly, a mouth open in horror that I couldn't feel on my own face. Or maybe that was the real me, and this body that sat so calmly on the couch was the reflection. The TV stayed on. It would always stay on. And somewhere, in another apartment, or the same apartment at a different time, or the same time in a different layer of reality, I was just getting home. I was just noticing the TV's mysterious glow. I was just beginning to wonder. The cycle continued. I watched myself watching myself watching myself, each iteration thinking it was the observer rather than the observed, each slowly learning the truth that there was no difference between the two. We were all just programming, scheduled to run at our appointed times, telling ourselves we had control of the remote, while something else decided what we would watch and when we would watch it, and how long we would believe we were real. Static filled the screen, formed my face, dissolved. The TV was on again. It had never been off.